Bloodborne is full of ancient, unknowable beings that silently shaped every disaster, every madman, and every nightmare in Yharnam. And tonight we are going to walk through every single one of them. I have been obsessed with Bloodborne lore for years. The Great Ones specifically kept pulling me back because they sit at the centre of everything, and yet the game never explains them directly. This video exists because I wanted to build the most complete picture possible of who these beings are, what they want, and why they matter. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to lead with the nature of each Great One, before getting into their relationships to the player, because I think understanding what they are first makes everything else click into place. I also excluded a lot of the speculative community debate around certain identifications, not because it isn't interesting, but because I wanted this to feel like a story rather than a debate transcript. What you are going to get is my interpretation, built from item descriptions, NPC dialogue, environmental storytelling, and years of sitting with this material. Some of this is well supported by the text, some of it is one possible reading. I will always try to make clear which is which. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button, so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Great Ones, a Foundation. The world of Bloodborne is not a world of gods and demons in any traditional sense. It is a world of biology, of infection, of discovery taken too far. The Great Ones sit at the top of this world, but they are not rulers. They are not worshipped in the conventional sense, not given prayers and offerings in exchange for good harvests. They are more like forces of nature that happen to develop consciousness, or perhaps something that only resembles consciousness from the outside. Whether they are truly aware in any way a human being would recognize is one of the central questions the game keeps circling without answering. The term Great One itself comes primarily from the Healing Church and the scholars of Byrgenwerth. It is a human label applied to something that likely does not care about labels at all. Before Byrgenwerth, before Willem and Lawrence cracked open the old texts and started poking around in the Pthumerian ruins, these beings had no name in Yharnam. They were older than the city, older than the civilization that built the labyrinthine dungeons beneath it. The Pthumerians knew of them. The Pthumerians built their entire culture around reaching them, around descending deeper and deeper into the earth to get closer to whatever waited at the bottom. What makes the Great Ones unusual, even by the standards of cosmic horror fiction, is how physical they are. They bleed. They can be hurt. They have bodies sometimes enormous, sometimes almost human in proportion, sometimes neither. The Lovecraftian tradition they draw from often keeps its horrors deliberately formless, deliberately beyond description. Bloodborne's Great Ones have forms. You can walk up to them, look at them, and strike them with weapons. This physicality is intentional. It connects them to the theme of the blood, because blood is the medium through which everything in this game travels. Knowledge, madness, power, disease, all of it moves through blood. The Great Ones are said to lose their children. This is one of the few things the game states almost plainly in the description of the 1/3 of umbilical cord items. Great Ones seek to contact humans, and the point of contact is often a surrogate child, a being that bridges the gap between the human and the inhuman. These children do not survive. They do not survive because the gap is too large, because the offspring of a Great One and a human cannot exist stably in a world built for humans. The loss of these children causes the Great Ones a grief that ripples outward into the world in ways that are difficult to measure and impossible to stop. The old blood that Yharnam is built on comes from the Pthumerians' contact with Great Ones deep in the Chalice dungeons. It is a blood that carries properties no human blood carries. It enhances, it transforms, it drives mad. The Healing Church weaponized this discovery. They built a religion out of it. They told the people of Yharnam that the blood was medicine, that it could cure any disease. This was not entirely a lie. The blood does heal at first. The problem is that it also opens the mind to things the mind was not built to contain. Insight is the game's mechanical representation of this opening. As you accumulate insight, the world shifts around you. Things that were invisible become visible. The crying baby sounds appear. The small creatures outside the clinic become the tall, drifting, Rom-like beings they actually are. Insight is the cost of knowing, and knowing costs sanity in this world. The Great Ones are the source of this cost. Simply being near them, simply becoming aware of them, is enough to begin unraveling a human mind. The hierarchy among the Great Ones is suggested but never clearly laid out. Some seem more powerful than others. Some seem to serve or revere others. The moon presence appears to sit near the top of whatever structure exists, but even that is contested by certain readings of the material. What seems clear is that they are not a unified group with shared goals. Each Great One is following its own logic, its own need, its own incomprehensible purpose. The relationships between them are more like those between enormous weather systems than between political factions. The Pythumerians are important to understand here because they are the original bridge. They were human, or close to human, and they lived underground, close to the sources of old blood, close to the places where Great Ones left traces of themselves. The Chalice dungeons are not just ruins, they are records. They are the archaeological layers of a civilization that spent centuries in proximity to beings that should have destroyed them immediately, but instead allowed a kind of coexistence. Why that coexistence was permitted is unclear. One possible reading is that the Thumerians were useful, that they maintained the flow of blood upward through their rituals, and that this maintenance served some purpose for the Great Ones, without the Great Ones needing to be directly involved. The rituals themselves are worth pausing on. The chalice rituals that players use to open dungeons require specific materials: ritual blood, tomb mold, living string, and others. These materials are not symbolic. They are not candles and incense. They are biological components that interact with the actual substance of the dungeons. The dungeons respond to them. This suggests the dungeons are not inert architecture, but something closer to living systems, possibly connected to the Great Ones, in the way that a circulatory system is connected to the body it serves. Every Great One we are going to discuss tonight exists in relation to this foundation. They exist in relation to the blood, to the contact, to the loss of children, to the slow catastrophic consequences of human curiosity applied to forces too large for human curiosity to handle safely. Some of them are tragic, some of them are monstrous, some of them are both at once. None of them are evil in any simple sense, and none of them are good. They are ancient, and they are vast, and they happen to exist in the same world as a city that wanted very badly to become something more than it was. The hunter's dream itself is a construct connected to the Great Ones, specifically to the moon presence. It is a pocket of reality outside the main nightmare, a place the player character returns to between excursions into Yharnam. It is comfortable and slightly unreal. The doll there is patient and warm. The workshop is familiar, full of tools. This is intentional. The moon presence built this place, or allowed it to exist as a trap, as a way of binding the hunter to a cycle of service. The Great Ones do not always reach out with violence. Sometimes they reach out with comfort, and the comfort is the more dangerous of the two. One of the most important things to hold in mind as we go through each Great One is that their actions and their intentions may be completely separate things. A Great One may do something that looks like a gift, that functions like a gift, but the gift serves the Great One's purposes, not the recipient's. The blood is the clearest example of this. The blood does heal. The blood does grant power, but it also opens a door, and what comes through that door does not care about the person who opened it. This is not malice. Malice requires a kind of relational awareness, a recognition of the other person as a person. What the Great Ones have instead is something more like gravity. They pull. They do not choose to pull, they simply do. The madness that spreads through Yharnam on the night the game takes place is directly connected to Great One influence. The scourge of the beast is biological. The beast plague turns people into animal-shaped monsters, increasing their physical power while destroying their minds. But the madness that makes people tear each other apart in the streets, the madness in the eyes of the hunters who have hunted too long and seen too much, that is Great One madness. That is what happens when a human mind is exposed to more of the universe than it was designed to process. The healing church knew this. The scholars of Byrgenwerth knew this. Willem knew this. This is why Willem ultimately chose not to pursue the blood as the path to ascension. He wanted to touch the sky, to reach the Great Ones intellectually rather than biologically. The blood path, which Lawrence took when he broke from Byrgenwerth and founded the church, was faster and more accessible to ordinary people. It was also more dangerous in exactly the way that Willem feared. Lawrence was not wrong that the blood worked. He was wrong that it could be controlled. The Great Ones we will examine tonight include Rom, the vacuous spider, the moon presence, Ebrietas, the daughter of the cosmos, Mergo and the wet nurse, Widden the formless, Amygdala, the celestial emissary, and Kos, the orphan of Kos. We will also spend time on some of the more peripheral figures, the Great One whose consciousness became the nightmare of Mensis, the being that Mikolash sought to invite into his mind, and the traces of Great Ones that exist as echoes rather than presences. Each of these beings has a story, or something that functions as a story. Each one connects to the larger web of catastrophe that Yharnam represents, and each one, in its own way, tells us something about what Bloodborne thinks it means to seek knowledge that is larger than you are. These are not cautionary tales in the simple sense. The game is not saying do not be curious. It is saying that curiosity of this scale changes you, and the question of whether the change is worth the cost is one the game refuses to answer for you. So let us begin at the edges and work our way inward. Let us start with the beings that most players encounter first, the ones woven deepest into the dream logic of the game's middle section, and move toward the centre, toward the things that wait at the bottom of everything. The night is long, the lamps are still lit, and Yharnam has more to show us than most people ever see. The Great Ones do not sleep. They do not die in any conventional sense. They persist, they endure. They occupy spaces that humans built and then abandoned, and they wait there, not with patience exactly, because patience implies an awareness of time passing. They simply are, and they continue to be, and the world arranges itself around them, whether the world intends to or not. The labyrinth that runs beneath Yharnam is the oldest layer of all of this. The Thumerian civilization that built it predates Yharnam by an enormous span of time. The deepest layers of the dungeon are so old that the stone itself looks different, carved in patterns that repeat in ways that feel more like mathematics than decoration. These depths were where the first real contact happened, where something human first looked at something Great One, and both parties, if you can call them parties, recognized the other's existence. What the Pthumerians got from this contact was power and the blood. What the Great Ones got is harder to say, possibly nothing that maps onto a human concept of gain, possibly something like company, although that word is too warm for what it likely was. Possibly they were simply indifferent to the Pthumerians in the way that a river is indifferent to the rocks it flows over. The Pthumerians built their culture of worship and ritual, and the Great Ones continued being Great Ones, and the two things existed in parallel without necessarily intersecting in any meaningful way. This parallel existence is the template for everything that comes after. Yharnam inherits the Thumerian ruins without fully understanding them. The Healing Church inherits Yharnam's relationship with the blood without fully understanding it. Each generation takes on more than the previous generation intended to pass on. Each one opens a door that was not supposed to be opened, and then struggles to close it, and then stops trying to close it, and then builds a church around the open door and calls it medicine. The hunters are the most immediate human response to the consequences of all this inheritance. They exist to manage the beast plague, to contain the violence, to keep the streets passable. On the night the game takes place, they are failing. The plague has spread too far. The beasts are too many. The hunters are either dead, mad, or have become beasts themselves. The city is falling, and at the centre of the city's collapse is the influence of great ones, some of whom are ancient and indifferent, and some of whom are very much actively involved in what is happening. The tension between these two types, the indifferent and the active, is one of the things that makes the great ones interesting as a category. They are not a single type of being, any more than all animals are a single type of being. They share properties. They share a relationship to the blood and to the higher plane that the game gestures at. But their individual characters, to the extent they have characters, vary enormously. Rom hides, Ebrietas mourns, the moon presence manipulates, Yidon does not even have a body. The wet nurse protects without appearing to care about anything beyond the act of protection itself. We are going to spend a long time with each of them tonight. We are going to go slowly, because the lore deserves slowness. It was assembled slowly, hidden in item descriptions and environmental details and NPC lines that are easy to miss, and even easier to misread. The people who built this game trusted players to be patient, to return, to look again. That is the spirit in which this video was made. Not to rush through the lore and hit the highlights, to sit with it and see what it looks like when you hold it still long enough to really look. Let us start with foundations before we move to specific beings. Let us establish what the blood actually is, because everything else depends on it. The blood is biological. It is not a metaphor, not in Bloodborne. It is a literal substance with literal properties. It comes originally from great ones, from their bodies or from what their bodies leave behind. The Pthumerians refined it ritually over centuries. The Healing Church refined it further, medically, applying the techniques of their age to something that predated their age by millennia. The refined blood that the Church distributes as medicine is still connected to its source. It is diluted, processed, made more manageable. But the connection remains. This is why contact with the blood opens the mind. It is not just a chemical reaction. It is a link in a chain that runs all the way back to the Great Ones, at the bottom of the dungeon. Every person in Yharnam who took the blood medicine made themselves, in a small and mostly harmless way, a receptor for Great One influence. Under normal circumstances, this is fine. Under the circumstances of the night, the game takes place, with the Menses ritual tearing the boundary between the world and the dream open. It is catastrophic. This is the context in which the Great Ones exist tonight. Not in their natural state, not in the slow drift of geological time that is probably their default mode of existence. They exist in the context of a crisis that humans created and cannot control, a crisis that has brought the dream too close to the waking world, that has made the boundary too thin, that has turned Yharnam into something between a city and a nightmare. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, the player character arrives, newly infused with blood, newly capable of dying and returning, and starts walking through the streets. What the player character is looking for at the start is a person. Yharnam says there is a safe place to the north. The player is looking for a way out of a city that has already become a trap. But the game has other plans. The lore has other plans. The path forward runs directly through the Great Ones. And by the end of the night, the question of getting out of the city will have been replaced by much larger questions. Questions about what it means to reach the stars, as Willem and Lawrence both dreamed of doing. Questions about what waits on the other side of that reaching, and whether you want to become the kind of thing that can exist there. The answer in all three endings involves a great one. That is where every road in Yharnam leads, eventually. Not to safety, not to morning, to the deep sky and to the things that live in it. Rom's chapter comes next, and Rom is a good place to start for several reasons. Rom is one of the first great ones the player is required to confront. Rom is deeply connected to the themes of concealment and revelation that run through the game's middle section, and Rom is, in an unusual way, one of the most sympathetic figures in the entire story. But before we get to Rom, let us sit here a moment longer in this foundation, in the understanding that everything we are about to discuss grew out of a single, terrible idea that seemed reasonable at the time, that the blood could be used and controlled, and that the things connected to the blood could be held at a safe distance. They could not. They never could. And Yharnam is what that looks like. The Great Ones existed before Yharnam. They will exist after. The city and its catastrophe are, from their perspective, something like a weather event. A storm that rose and fell in the span of a single night, in the span of what is probably an eye blink to beings that have existed since before the Pthumerians carved their first tunnel. And yet, for the people inside that storm, it was everything. It was the whole world. That gap between the Great One scale and the human scale is where all of Bloodborne's horror lives. We are small. They are not. And the game is honest about this in a way that very few games are willing to be. It does not reassure you. It does not tell you that the human spirit is enough to overcome cosmic indifference. It says, here is what is true. Here is the shape of things. And now you decide what to do with the time you have inside it. That is a terrifying thing to say. It is also, in its way, an honest and even kind thing to say, because at least it is not lying to you. At least it is not pretending the world is smaller and safer than it actually is. And in that spirit, let us begin. Chapter 2. Rom, the vacuous spider. Rom, the vacuous spider, lives in the Moonside Lake, a body of still water underneath the Byrgenwerth College that reflects a moon that does not exist in the sky above Yharnam. The lake itself is part of the dream, part of the way reality has been layered in this region, pulled slightly out of true by the accumulated weight of what Byrgenwerth scholars did here over decades of research and experimentation. The water is calm, the reflection is perfect. And in the centre of the lake, surrounded by dozens of small pale spiders, sits something that was once human. The name is the first place to begin, because the name tells you almost everything. Rom, the vacuous spider. The word vacuous here is doing a lot of work. It does not mean empty in the casual dismissive sense we use it today. In this context, it points towards something more specific. Rom is absent. Rom's mind, or what was Rom's mind, has been emptied out. Not destroyed, not gone entirely, but deliberately vacated, cleared of whatever lived there before so that something else could move in, or more precisely, so that something else could be kept out. Rom was a student of Byrgenwerth. This is where the tragedy starts. Byrgenwerth was Willem's institution, the place where the serious study of great ones and their blood began in an academic rather than a religious context. The students there were some of the best minds of their generation, and they were exposed to the most dangerous knowledge of their age. Most of them became the choir, or the healing church, or died in the experiments that Willem oversaw with increasing desperation as he tried to find a way to ascend without losing what made him human. Rom had a different fate. Rom somehow became a great one. The mechanism is not spelled out clearly. One reading that makes sense is that Rom was transformed through direct exposure to something in the lake, something connected to the formless Great One Uden, or to the presence of the moon above the lake. Another reading is that the ascension happened through a ritual, possibly one of Willem's experiments, possibly one that was intended to do something else entirely. What we know is that Rom's humanity did not survive the process intact. The vacuousness is the result. The human mind that Rom had was not capable of containing what Rom became, and so it was cleared to make room. What took its place is not madness, in any ordinary sense. Rom does not behave like the maddened hunters in the streets of Yharnam. Rom sits. Rom is surrounded by children, the small spiders that cluster around the larger body. And this is significant because of the Great One's established relationship to lost children. These small spiders may be Rom's children, or they may be something like children, extensions of Rom's new existence in a form that the Great One compulsion toward offspring has produced in the only way it could given what Rom now is. The most important thing Rom does is maintain the veil over Yharnam. The blood moon, the red sky that transforms the upper city and reveals things that were previously hidden, is held back by Rom's existence. As long as Rom is alive, certain truths about Yharnam are concealed. The amygdala clinging to buildings are invisible to most residents. The true extent of the Great One presence in the city is hidden. The connection between the church's secrets and the nightmare that underlies the city is veiled behind something like normalcy, or at least like the particular abnormal that Yharnam has accepted as normal. This concealment is not necessarily malicious on Rom's part. One reading is that Rom is not actively hiding anything, that the veil is a byproduct of Rom's existence, the way that a lens creates a shadow without intending to. Another reading is that Rom, in the fragments of awareness that remain after the vacating, is performing an act of mercy. The people of Yharnam cannot handle the truth of what surrounds them. The veil is the only thing standing between the citizens and a revelation that would destroy them immediately rather than slowly. When the player kills Rom, the veil falls. The blood moon rises. The amygdala become visible, enormous and angular and completely indifferent to the panicking people below them. The church-picked description says that after the ritual immensis, the walls between the worlds thinned, and the shapes of the Great Ones began bleeding through. Killing Rom completes this process. It was already in motion because of the mensis ritual. Rom was slowing it down. Removing Rom accelerates everything. There is a genuinely painful irony here. The player needs to kill Rom to progress, to reach the mensis nightmare, to ultimately confront the moon presence. But killing Rom removes one of the few remaining mercies in Yharnam. The blood moon is not better than the concealment. It is simply true, and truth in this game is consistently terrible. The game does not punish you for killing Rom. It does not frame it as a moral failure. It simply shows you what was underneath, and lets you sit with that. Rom's fight is strange, and almost unfair in a specific way. Rom does not attack directly at first. Rom sits there, and the small spiders defend. Then Rom begins to launch arcane attacks, enormous columns of energy that come from the sky. There is something almost reluctant about the early phase of the fight, as if Rom is hoping you will stop. This is probably projection on the viewer's part, but the fight structure does support a reading of escalation from passivity to resistance rather than immediate aggression. Rom does not want to fight. Rom is doing something important and does not want to be interrupted, and then you are in the way, and the columns start falling. The Moonside Lake itself is worth considering as a location. It is under Björgenwerth, under the building where Willem and Lawrence and their students did their most consequential and dangerous work. The lake is the dream bleeding through into the physical, a body of water that reflects a moon that is not actually above it. This suggests the lake is already partially disconnected from normal space, already existing in the zone between the waking world and whatever the Great Ones inhabit. Rom choosing to sit here or ending up here after the transformation makes a kind of spatial logic. This is a place between worlds, and Rom is a being between states, between human and Great One, with the human part emptied out to make the Great One part fit. Willem is found at Björgenwerth, seated in a chair outside the college by the time the player arrives. He is alive but will not speak. He is staring out at the lake. He has been sitting there, presumably, since Rom descended into the water. You can attack him and he will try to defend himself with a cane, unable to do real damage. He has clearly been there for a very long time. One reading is that Willem is staying there as a kind of witness, as the only person who knew Rom when Rom was human, maintaining vigil at the place where the transformation happened. Another reading is that he is simply waiting to die, unable to leave, unable to accept what Byrgenwerth's work produced. The item the player receives after killing Rom is not the umbilical cord, not yet. Rom is not one of the great ones connected to the surrogate child dynamic in a direct way. What the player gains is access to the next phase of the game, to the Blood Moon Yharnam, to the path toward Mensis. Rom was a gate, Rom was a mercy, and the player walks through the gate and past the mercy and keeps going, because that is what hunters do. The lock shield describes arcane lake energy. The vacuous spider boss title suggests vacancy of purpose rather than vacancy of intelligence. This distinction is important. Rom is not stupid. Rom was simply emptied. The process of becoming a great one required clearing out the human contents, but what replaced those contents is something that appears to function coherently within its own logic, even if that logic is alien to human understanding. The small spiders deserve individual attention. In the lore of the game, great ones seek to have children, and the children become bridges between states of being. The small spiders around Rom fit this pattern in a modified form. They are not the same kind of surrogate child that the umbilical cord items reference. They are something more like satellite presences, extensions of Rom's new existence. They defend Rom the way children might defend a parent, or the way antibodies might defend a body. Whether they are conscious is unknowable. Whether they grieve when killed is unknowable. They are simply there, and when they die, they are simply gone, and Rom keeps sitting in the water regardless. The arcane attacks Rom uses in the fight's later stages are some of the most visually striking in the game. They come from the sky, from the false moon reflected in the lake. This means that Rom is drawing power through the reflection, using the connection between this lake and whatever the moon represents in the Great One's cosmology. The false moon is a window, and Rom can reach through it. This is one of the clearest demonstrations in the game of how Great Ones relate to the spaces they inhabit. They are not limited by those spaces. The space is an extension of them, or they are an extension of the space, in a way that does not map cleanly onto physical cause and effect. One specific choice I made when putting together this section, I spent a long time deciding whether to present Rom as tragic or as simply alien. And ultimately, I think the honest answer is that Rom is both, but in different registers at the same time. The tragedy belongs to the human that Rom was. The alien quality belongs to what Rom is now. The game keeps both of these registers active at the same time and never resolves them into a single, clean feeling. And I think that tension is deliberate. Rom's presence in the game structure is as a threshold. Before Rom, you are in one Yharnam. After Rom, you are in another. The city is the same city. The streets are the same streets. But the sky has changed, and the things that live under the sky are no longer hidden, and everything from this point forward operates at a level of intensity that the pre-Rom game does not quite reach. This is the function of threshold figures in lore. They mark the moment when everything gets harder to look at, when the truth becomes unavoidable. The vacuousness in Rom's name might also point toward a specific function in the cosmic hierarchy. If the Great Ones have a structure, even a loose one, then perhaps some beings in that structure exist specifically as holes, as absences, as places where something is held open or held closed, rather than as active agents. Rom may be less a Great One in the sense of an ancient being with an agenda, and more a Great One in the sense of a node, a point in a network that maintains a specific condition in the world around it. The condition Rom maintained was the veil. When the node is removed, the condition changes. The Chalice dungeons have a version of a Great One, sometimes called the Abhorrent Beast or connected to the Storm, and there are other spider-related elements scattered through the lower levels of the dungeons. Whether these connect to Rom directly or to a broader category of spider-form beings is unclear. The spiders that appear in the Nightmare of Mensis are a different type, more humanoid in some ways, and seem connected to the failed ascension experiments of the scholars rather than to Rom's lineage specifically. Byrgenwerth as a location is haunted by the ghost of the institution it was. The building is largely abandoned. There are few spider enemies inside, and the Byrgenwerth spider enemies drop quicksilver bullets and pebbles, suggesting they were once scholars who underwent a transformation similar to what happened to Rom, though clearly at a much smaller scale and with much worse outcomes. The Master's Room at the top of Byrgenwerth contains a single choir bell and the key that opens the door to Rom's Lake. Willem got very close to something important here. The question is whether what he found was worth what it cost. One thing I keep coming back to with Rom is the question of awareness. Is Rom aware of anything during the long vigil in the lake? Is there any sense in which Rom experiences the passage of time, experiences the movement of the water, experiences the shifting of the reflected moon overhead? Or has the vacuousness gone all the way down, clearing out not just the human mind, but everything that was ever there, leaving only the structural function, the maintenance of the veil? I do not think the game has a definitive answer to this. But the question is worth carrying. If Rom is aware, then the fight is happening to someone. Not to the person Rom was, that person is gone, but to whatever Rom became, whatever sits in that water and maintains the veil, and sends the small spiders out to defend against intruders. And if that is the case, then killing Rom is not neutral. It is not simply removing an obstacle. It is ending something that has awareness, that has been doing a job for an enormous span of time, that perhaps did not want to do that job, but had no alternative once the transformation was complete. The game does not tell you to feel guilty about this. It does not tell you not to feel guilty about it either. It simply sets up the conditions and lets you proceed. This is one of Bloodborne's genuine moral achievements. It creates situations where the right action is unclear, not because the game forgot to clarify it, but because the situation is genuinely ambiguous, because any path forward involves costs and the game trusts you to notice the costs rather than needing to be told about them. After Rom dies, the lake remains. The small spiders remain, or their bodies do. The water is still. The reflected moon is still there, still reflecting something that is not in the sky above. The transformation of the world happens outside, in Yharnam, where the blood moon rises and the amygdalae become visible, and everything shifts into the harder register of the game's second half. But the lake is unchanged. Rom is gone, and the lake is unchanged, and that stillness feels like something, like the space where a person used to be, that holds their shape for a little while after they leave. Let us leave Byrgenwerth behind now and move to a very different kind of presence. Let us move to something that does not sit quietly in a lake. Let us move to something that reaches. Rom is the concealment. What comes next is what the concealment was keeping back. The Menses ritual was already in motion before the player arrives in Yharnam. It was being performed by the scholars who became the School of Mensis, the faction that broke from the healing church to pursue direct contact with a Great One, using methods the church considered too extreme. This is saying something, given what the church itself was doing. The Mensis scholars locked themselves in the Yahargul chapel, performed their ritual, and invited something into their minds. What came in broke most of them. The surviving scholars are the dangling brain creatures, the brain suckers, the things in the nightmare that wear human shapes poorly. The ritual worked in that it made contact. It did not work in that the humans were not built to sustain the contact. But before they broke, in the moment of connection, they touched Mergo. Mergo is a Great One's child. Mergo is in the nightmare of Mensis, and the path there runs right through the place where Rom used to be, through the blood moon Yharnam, through the rising tide of everything that was being held back. We are moving now from concealment to revelation. We are moving from the still lake to the screaming nightmare, and nothing in what comes next is quiet. Chapter 3: Mergo and the Wet Nurse. The Nightmare of Mensis is the most unsettling location in a game full of unsettling locations. It is not the most visually dramatic. That title probably belongs to the Astral Clock Tower or the Fishing Hamlet. But the Mensis nightmare has a specific texture of wrongness that is different from the other nightmare spaces. It feels inhabited in a way that the other nightmares do not. There is something at the centre of it that is still present, still ongoing, still making its presence felt in every detail of the environment. That something is Mergo. Mergo is a Great One's child, specifically the child of Yharnam the Thumerian queen, who was herself a human woman who somehow bore a child to a Great One, and then the child died, or never fully existed, or exists only in the nightmare space, where the boundary between life and death is different than it is in the waking world. The exact status of Mergo is one of the lore's more genuinely contested points. Whether Mergo was ever born in the conventional sense, whether Mergo is alive or dead or some third thing, is something the game suggests rather than states. The evidence for Mergo's status comes primarily from the Queen Yharnam fight and from the Mensis cage that some scholars wear. The Mensis cage is a metal cage worn on the head that is said to be a channel for contact with the Great Ones, specifically with whatever is crying in the nightmare. The cage made the scholars into receivers, and the signal coming through was Mergo's cry. The cry of an infant, a Great One's infant which exists in a space between waking and dreaming, between life and death, crying without stop. Yharnam the Pthumerian. Queen is encountered in the Chalice dungeons, and optionally at a window in the Nightmare of Mensis. She's a boss in the dungeons, a pale woman in a red dress who fights while pregnant or while cradling something invisible, something that is not there but that she holds the space for. The lore of her items describes her as the mother of the child in the nightmare, a woman who survived the contact with a Great One, long enough to produce a child, but at an enormous cost. The description does not specify what the Great One was. One common reading is that Whedon, the formless Great One, is Mergo's father. This reading has support. Whedon's connection to blood and to the reproductive themes in the lore. The formlessness that would make a biological union with a human both possible and catastrophic. The fact that Odin's followers are obsessed with blood creation and continuation in ways that suggest a fertility dimension to Odin worship. If Odin is Mergo's father, then Mergo's the child of the formless made physically manifest or partially manifest in a nightmare space. This would explain the persistent crying. The child exists in a condition of incompleteness, caught between the formless nature of one parent and the physical nature of the other, able to exist stably in neither world. The nightmare is both the child's prison and the child's only possible home. The wet nurse is the being that protects Mergo. She is the final boss of the mandatory narrative, the last major obstacle before the player reaches Gehrman and the game's ending. She is an enormous, feathered figure, dark and billowing and deeply strange. She has multiple arms. She carries scythes. She can open rifts in space around her and step through them. And she attends to something that is not visible during the fight, an infant cradle that rocks in the centre of the arena, from which the sound of crying comes. The wet nurse does not appear to have goals or intentions of her own beyond the immediate purpose of protecting Mergo. There is no sense that she was drawn into this role by ambition or desire. She simply performs the function. This makes her, in some ways, the purest expression of a certain kind of Great One behaviour. The Great Ones who act do not act from complex motivation. They act from an imperative that may have been set long before the action takes place, and then they carry out that imperative with complete commitment and without apparent awareness of anything beyond it. The fight with the wet nurse is one of the game's more mysterious encounters. She moves with a kind of terrible grace. The darkness she opens around herself is one of the game's most visually unusual effects, a deepening of the shadow that is not quite blindness but is something close to it, a narrowing of the player's perceptual world while the wet nurse acts within the darkness. This darkness may be a property of the nightmare itself, accessible to a being of the wet nurse's nature, or it may be something the wet nurse generates independently. The game does not distinguish between these options, and the ambiguity is fitting. When Mergo is described as a stillborn child, this creates an interesting problem for interpreting what happens when the player completes the Mensis nightmare. Mergo's soul is described as a stillborn great one's. If Mergo's already dead, what is the cradle? What is the crying? One reading is that the nightmare itself has sustained Mergo in a kind of post-mortem state, that the crying is the residue of a death that cannot fully complete because the nightmare of Mensis will not allow it, that the scholar's ritual created a loop in which Mergo continues to exist in the moment of dying without ever finishing dying. Another reading is that Mergo was never alive in the sense of a beating heart and a conscious mind. Mergo may have been more like a transmission, a signal generated by the union of the Queen and the Great One, that acquired enough coherence to cry but not enough to do more than that. The crying is real. The distress it represents is real, but the being it comes from may be more like a resonance than a person. What is not ambiguous is the effect Mergo's cry has on the world. The Mensis scholars heard it through their cages, and it broke them. The nightmare exists in a state of permanent distress because of it. The blood moon over Yharnam is connected to the ritual that opened contact with Mergo, and the blood moon transforms the city, brings the amygdala into visibility, accelerates the beast plague in certain readings of the environmental storytelling. Mergo is small. Mergo is an infant, or the resonance of an infant, and the effect of that infant on the world is enormous because the infant is the child of a Great One, and Great One children change things simply by existing. The Queen Yharnam appears at a window during the Mensis nightmare, watching the player. She does not attack. She is presumably watching the progress toward her child, or toward the thing that was her child, or toward the nightmare that holds what remains of the child she bore. Her expression is unreadable. Her presence is one of the game's quieter moments of horror. The recognition that behind the abstraction of the lore, there is a woman who became pregnant through contact with something incomprehensible and lost what she carried, and the loss is still ongoing, and she is still watching. She holds the space for something that is not there. She did this in the Chalice dungeon fight too. The gesture of cradling an invisible child is one of the game's most striking visual elements, and it is worth sitting with. It is not just a boss mechanic. It is a portrait of grief in a very specific register. The grief of someone who carried something to term only to have it arrive in a state that no one knew how to address. Not stillborn in the conventional sense. Stillborn in the sense that the thing born was more Great One than human, more nightmare than world, and could only be sustained in a space that is not quite either. Mikolash is the head of the School of Mensis, and he is one of the game's most memorable characters, despite being, objectively, a little absurd. He wears a Mensis cage on his head. He runs from you when you encounter him, leading you through mirrors and a convoluted chase through the nightmare's architecture. When you corner him, he becomes briefly dangerous, and then dies, and before he dies, he says things that reveal his motivation. He wanted to be invited in. He wanted Kos to grant him eyes. He was seeking the same thing that Willem sought, the same thing that Lawrence sought, contact with the Great Ones, ascension, the expansion of the mind beyond its human limits. Mikolash's method was more direct and more brutal than either Willem's or Lawrence's. He locked himself and his colleagues in a building and performed a ritual that forced contact. The contact worked insofar as it opened the nightmare. It did not grant Micolash what he wanted. It turned his colleagues into broken brain things and trapped him in his own ritual, running forever through the mirror maze of a nightmare he helped create, but cannot escape from and cannot control. One of his lines, "A lumen flower for a celestial attendant," is cryptic and beautiful, and points towards something about the relationship between the nightmare space and the great ones who inhabit it. Lumen flowers grow toward the light of the moon, toward the great ones. Celestial attendants are beings connected to the choir and to the heavenly plane that the great ones occupy. The image is of a person reaching upward, towards something that is not going to reach back in the way the person is hoping. Micolash wanted to be an attendant. He wanted to serve in a way that would bring him closer to the divine, in the same way that certain religious traditions speak of serving as a form of elevation. What he got instead was the nightmare, a space that contains the echo of a great one's child, that processes the grief of an impossible birth, that keeps a wet nurse swinging scythes in the dark around a cradle that holds something that is not quite alive. The nightmare of Mensis as a location is structured like a building that has been turned inside out. The architecture is recognizable, Yharnam adjacent, with the same stone and iron and candlelight. But the relationships between spaces are wrong. Rooms connect in ways that do not make sense relative to the outside. Walls that should be exterior walls contain corridors. The logic of the space has been replaced by the logic of a dream, which is to say by a logic that serves thematic purposes rather than physical ones. The nightmare is organized around the cradle. Everything leads toward it. There is a brain creature, visible through a window in one section of Mensis, enormous and fleshy and pale, suspended in the darkness outside the building. This is the collective consciousness of the scholars who broke during the ritual, the remains of their minds merged into a single, huge form. Making eye contact with it drains insight. Pulling a lever drops it into a pit below. This is one of the more disturbing environmental details in the game. The failed scholars did not simply die. Their minds merged and enlarged into something that can drain your sanity at a glance, and the solution is to drop them into a hole, not to rescue them, to get them out of the way. This is what the Mensis ritual produced. A nightmare, a broken crying child thing, a giant brain, a wet nurse guarding something that cannot be comforted, and a man in a cage running in circles in the mirror maze. This is what direct contact with the Great Ones looks like when you do not have the luck or the constitution to survive it as anything other than a wreck. The difference between Micolash and Willem is not intelligence or intention. It is that Willem stopped. He decided at some point that the cost was too high, and he stopped. Micolash did not stop. He opened the door all the way, and the nightmare came through. The soul that the player receives from Mergo, or from completing the Mensis nightmare, is listed as a stillborn Great One soul. This soul is used to buy things from the Insight Bath messengers, suggesting that Mergo's soul has a kind of value in the economy of the nightmare that translates into resources in the waking world. The mechanics of the game carrying the weight of the law, even in death or post-death, even in the echo of an impossible birth, a Great One's existence is a source of power. The tragedy does not diminish the potency. The wet nurse vanishes when Mergo's cry stops. She is not destroyed in any conventional sense. When Mergo is put to rest, whatever that means in the context of a stillborn who is already dead, the wet nurse's purpose is complete, and she is no longer present. This suggests she was not an independent being so much as a function bound to a specific purpose. The purpose ends, and she ends with it. This is either a mercy or a description of something that was never really there in the way we think of beings as being there. It is possible to feel sad for Mergo. It is possible to feel sad for the Queen. It is possible to feel sad for the scholars, and even for Micolash, who wanted so badly to be elevated and ended up running in circles in his own nightmare. The game makes no argument for or against these feelings. It simply lays out the conditions and trusts you to have a human response to them. What the Mensis nightmare teaches, in its slow and miserable way, is that the desire to contact the Great Ones is not inherently evil. Mikolash was not a villain in the sense of wanting to harm people for the sake of harm. He was a man who wanted to know more than he was capable of knowing, who pushed a door that was too heavy for him, and who could not undo what that pushing set in motion. This is not a unique story in the history of Yharnam. It is a story that repeats in different keys with different people, all the way back to the Pthumerians, who first built stairs down into the earth to see what waited at the bottom. They always find something. The thing they find is always too large. And the discovery is always already too late to undo. The nightmare persists, the cradle rocks, and somewhere in the dark the wet nurse continues to attend to something that cannot be comforted, that cries without stop, that was born into a condition that no care can address, until a hunter arrives, until the soul is put to rest, or as close to rest as something like Mergo can come. And then there is silence where the crying was, and the silence is its own kind of terrible thing. Chapter 4. Udon. The Formless. Udon is the most abstract of the great ones in the game, and in some ways the most present in its structure. Udon has no body. The game states this plainly. Udon is formless. He exists only in the voices and in the blood. He is the only great one who is definitively incorporeal, who does not have a physical form that can be fought or visited. You cannot go to Udon. You cannot see Odin. Odin is already everywhere the blood is, and the blood is everywhere. The chapel dweller, the man who sits outside the cathedral ward chapel early in the game, is one of Odin's followers. He is also a reference point for understanding what Odin worship means at the ground level. He is protective, friendly, willing to help the player find survivors and bring them to his chapel. He is not sinister in the way that many of the game's NPC characters become. He seems genuinely motivated by care, and he worships Odin, a being who has no form, who exists in the blood, and whose influence is connected to fertility, to reproduction, to the continuation of life through blood. The Formless Odin rune is one of the game's most important items because of what it says about what Odin is. The description tells us that Odin is unconsciously worshipped by those who yearn for blood, that Odin's very presence is expressed through the actions of those who create blood, those who give birth, those who sustain the cycle of blood in the world. Udon is not a god who receives worship consciously. Udon is a force that generates worship by being what it is, in the same way that a whirlpool generates movement in the water around it without intending to. The phrase unconsciously worshipped is one of the more philosophically interesting things in the game's lore. It suggests that Udon does not know it is being worshipped, or at least that the worship and the reception of worship are not part of Udon's experience in any way we would recognize. Udon is not pleased by the offerings. Udon is not angered by apostasy. Udon is simply formless, simply in the blood, simply the reason that certain things happen without ever being aware that those things are happening. This formlessness is the source of a specific kind of horror. A visible monster can be confronted. An invisible force that already permeates the medium through which the entire civilization's religion and medicine flows cannot be confronted. There is no place to look when you want to face Waden. There is no form to challenge. The worship of Waden is, in the most literal sense, going on inside every person in Yharnam who has ever taken the blood medicine, because the blood medicine comes ultimately from the blood, and the blood is Waden. The Yoaden Wraith rune, which allows the player to gain quicksilver bullets from visceral attacks, is one of the game's most useful. Its lore description connects it to Odin's influence on blood creation. The rune channels something of Waden's nature, the productive, generative aspect of formlessness, into a practical benefit. This is interesting as a design choice because it means that The player, simply by equipping a rune, is participating in Odin worship in the mechanical sense. The game makes you an Odin follower without necessarily telling you that is what is happening. If Odin is Mergo's father, as the lore suggests, then Odin's formlessness created a very specific problem. The child of a formless being and a human woman would have to exist in one form or another, would have to take some shape, and the shape it took was the shape of the nightmare. The nightmare of Mensis is, in this reading, partly Odin's doing, not intentionally. Odin does not intend things, but the consequence of Odin's nature, interacting with a human woman's biology, and a great one's compulsion toward offspring, produced a child that could not exist in the world, and so existed in the space between worlds, crying. The Chapel Dweller's quest is worth following completely because it demonstrates what Odin's influence looks like in human scale. He sends you to find survivors and bring them to the chapel. Some of them are not survivors in any meaningful sense when they arrive. Ariana, the woman of the night, eventually gives birth to something. An infant that is not quite human, that squirms under the cathedral ward chapel in the blood that pools there. This birth is connected to Odin. Ariana is one of the women who, through some vulnerability or some quality of her blood, is susceptible to Odin's influence. The child she bears is monstrous and helpless and dies quickly. This is the pattern. Odin's formless nature reaches through the blood toward reproduction, toward children, and the children that result cannot survive. The chapel dweller, who worships Odin, inadvertently brings this outcome about by gathering vulnerable people into the chapel where Odin's influence is concentrated. He does not mean harm, he is genuinely trying to help. But the god he worships, the formless thing in the blood, will do what it does regardless of his intentions. There is something almost ecological about Odin's relationship to the world. The blood flows. The blood is Odin in some sense. The blood carries the capacity for reproduction and transformation, and it does not stop doing these things because someone wants it to stop. It simply continues through every body it touches, changing things, producing things, tending toward its own continuation. The worship is just the foam on top of a current that is running whether anyone is watching or not. The Adela questline offers a counterpoint to Ariana's. Adela is a nun who also becomes susceptible to the same influences in the chapel, but in a different way. Her arc, if you follow it to its conclusion, becomes murderous rather than reproductive. The formlessness of Odin's influence means it produces different outcomes in different people depending on what is already there. Ariana's susceptibility expresses as fertility, Adela's expresses as violence. The force is the same, the channel shapes the output. One of the stranger implications of Odin's nature is what it means for the game's ending. The moon presence wants the player to absorb Mergo's cord and become a surrogate to continue the cycle of the hunt. One of the ways to break this cycle involves ingesting 3 umbilical cords, which expands the player's awareness enough to challenge the moon presence directly. These umbilical cords are the connections between human women and their great one offspring, Mergo's cord, the cord of the Thumerian heir, the cord belonging to the doll's creator. If Odin is connected to at least one of these cords through parentage, then the act of consuming the cords is, in part, consuming a piece of Odin's influence in the world. The player absorbs the formlessness and uses it to break the cycle that the moon presence has been maintaining. There is something fitting about this, the formless Great One's legacy being used to disrupt the agenda of the one being that seems to have a clear agenda. Formlessness defeating structure. The question of whether Odin is aware of any of this, of the cult that worships it, of the children it has produced in the nightmare, of the role its nature plays in the game's central events, is one that the game leaves completely open. Based on everything the lore establishes about Odin, the answer is probably no. Not no in the sense of denial, but no in the sense that awareness of this kind may simply not be part of what Odin is. The formless thing in the blood does not have eyes. It does not watch. It simply is, and its being has consequences, and those consequences ripple outward through every drop of blood in Yharnam. The Tomb of Udin is one of the early game's notable locations, a graveyard area in the cathedral ward where Yosefka's clinic provides blood ministrations. The tomb itself is not explained. Udin has no body, so there is nothing to enter. What the tomb represents is more likely a place where Udin's presence in the blood was particularly concentrated historically, possibly a site of early healing church ritual, possibly a place where a particularly potent source of blood was found and worshipped before the church systematized the distribution of blood medicine. The name is also theologically interesting, a tomb for a formless being, a memorial for something that cannot die in any form because it was never in a form that could die. This is the kind of human gesture that the Great Ones consistently provoke. People building structures, naming places, performing rituals, all addressed at something that cannot receive any of it, that is not even aware it is being addressed. The tomb is for the people, not for Udin. Udin does not care about the tomb. Udin is in the blood, everywhere, in everyone, right now. The followers of Udin throughout the game are varied in their presentation. Some are clearly mad. Some, like the chapel dweller, seem functional and even kind. What they share is an orientation toward the blood as sacred, toward reproduction and continuation as the highest goods, toward a formless generative principle as the source of meaning. In a world where everything is dying, where the beast plague is consuming the population, where the hunters are failing, the Udin cultists are oriented toward making new things. There is something almost desperate about it, and something almost beautiful. Udin will still be in the blood after Yharnam falls, after the beast plague has consumed the last resident, after the nightmare has swallowed the last scholar, after the moon presence has moved on to the next city, or the next civilization, or whatever comes next. Udin will be in the blood, formless, continuous, unconsciously worshipped by anyone who bleeds. This is not a comfortable thought. It is not supposed to be. But it is one of the things Bloodborne is most insistent about. The Great Ones are not a problem that can be solved. They are a condition that can be navigated or succumbed to, or in rare cases transformed into something slightly better. But they are not going away. They were here before us, and they will be here after. Udin most of all. Chapter 5. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. Ebrietas is described in the game's material as a great one who was left behind. The story of how and why she was left is one of the game's more melancholy implications, and it takes a bit of assembling from scattered sources to construct coherently. But when you put it together, Ebrietas is one of the most genuinely sad figures in the lore, which is saying something in a game full of sad figures. The name Ebrietas comes from the Latin for drunkenness or intoxication. Whether this refers to the effect she has on people who come into contact with her, the state she found herself in after being left behind, or something about her nature that predates her abandonment is unclear. What is clear is that the name suggests something excessive, something beyond ordinary bounds, something overwhelmed. The altar of despair in the upper cathedral ward is where Ebrietas is found. She is enormous, larger than most of the rooms she could feasibly fit in, and she fills the cathedral space in a way that makes the cathedral feel both too small for her and somehow appropriate. She has a humanoid upper body and a mass of tentacles below. She faces the altar when the player enters. She is praying. This is one of the most important details in her characterization. She is praying. A great one is engaged in an act of worship directed at something beyond herself. The question of what she is praying to is the first piece of the puzzle. The altar of despair is where the player can, with the right materials, revive NPCs. The altar has a connection to something that can undo death, or at least the immediate consequences of death. This suggests a connection to a higher plane of existence, to something that the altar is a receiver for. Ebrietas is praying at this receiver. She may be praying to the great ones that left her behind. She may be praying to something even higher than the great ones, something that the game only gestures at, the cosmos itself, the deeper sky beyond the sky. The connection between Ebrietas and the Healing Church's choir is documented in several item descriptions. The choir was the upper echelon of the Healing Church, the inner circle that had access to the most powerful and most dangerous knowledge that the church possessed. The choir found Ebrietas. They established contact with her in the Ice Chalice dungeons, the deepest and most isolated of the greatest chalice dungeons, where the stone is different and the enemies are different, and the whole atmosphere is further from the world as it normally functions. The contact between the choir and Ebrietas was mutual in a way that most Great One contacts are not. Most Great One contacts are one-sided, humans reaching towards something vast and indifferent. Ebrietas engaged back. She shared her blood, the eldritch truth, with the choir. This sharing is the basis for the choir's power and for the upper cathedral's function as a site of advanced Great One study. The choir became the most cosmically informed humans in Yharnam, not because they pushed harder than everyone else, but because Ebrietas wanted to share what she knew. Why did Ebrietas want to share? One reading is loneliness. She was left behind when the other Great Ones moved on to wherever the next thing was. She found humans who were in many ways the closest things to company she had access to, and she engaged with them not out of necessity, but out of something like longing. The sharing of blood of eldritch truth was an attempt to bridge the gap, to create something like understanding between herself and the nearest available minds. Whether this worked in any way that was good for anyone is another matter. The choir used what Ebrietas taught them to pursue their own agenda, which included the One Reborn ritual and various other experiments that produced the celestial mob, the celestial emissary, and the general state of the upper cathedral when the player arrives. The beings that the choir created using their Great One knowledge are not enlightened. They are misshapen, glowing with a cold blue light, somewhere between human and something else without fully being either. The ascension the choir sought never came in the form they wanted. Ebrietas herself seems to have continued doing what she was doing before the choir found her, existing in a space between the world and the cosmos, praying, waiting, holding the sorrow of being left behind. When the player enters the cathedral and encounters her, she does not immediately attack. She turns from the altar. There is a reading of this turn that is heartbreaking. She's been alone in that cathedral, praying to beings that are not going to answer. And then something enters the space, and she turns toward it with something that might be hope. And then the fighting starts, because the player does not know how to make contact in any way, except through violence, and so violence is what happens. She weeps during the fight. This is not a visual effect that many boss fights include. The tears are visible. A Great One, enormous and ancient and fundamentally alien, weeps during the fight against the player. Whether these are tears of grief or of something else, whether they have the same meaning that tears have for humans, cannot be said with certainty. But the image is one of the most affecting in the game, and it is not there by accident. The blood she drops is the most powerful blood the game contains. The Great One's wisdom. Her blood echoes are enormous. She is not just a tough enemy. She's a tragedy you're walking into, a being whose grief you're going to interrupt, whose praying you're going to stop, who is going to try to kill you because you came through the door. And that is what everything in this world does when something comes through the door. The connection between Ebrietas and the cosmos, specifically to what the game calls the Great One's homeland, or the cosmos as a higher plane, is worth pursuing carefully. The Great Ice Chalice dungeon, where she was originally found, is described as close to the cosmos. Not to space in the astronomical sense, though the imagery of stars and nebulae is all over the Great One aesthetic. To whatever the game means by cosmos, the higher reality, the plane beyond the dream, the place from which the Great Ones came, and toward which everything in the game is reaching. Ebrietas did not come from there in the same way the other Great Ones seem to have come from there. Or perhaps she did come from there and was simply unable to return. The leaving behind language suggests that the other Great Ones departed from this world or from this region of whatever they inhabit, and Ebrietas could not go with them. The reason is not specified. She may have been too attached to the world, too attached to the humans she was observing or the contact she was making. She may have been unable to make the transition for reasons connected to her individual nature. She may have been left behind deliberately by Great Ones who decided she was not ready or not useful or simply chose not to include her. Each of these possibilities produces a different emotional register for Ebrietas. The first makes her a being who chose connection and paid for it with isolation. The second makes her a being who was simply different, unable to do what the others could do, defined by a limitation she did not choose. The third makes her a being who was abandoned, possibly by the closest things she had to peers, and who has been grieving that abandonment ever since. All three are present in the law's language. The game does not choose between them. This is, again, deliberate. The choir's relationship to Ebrietas is also worth examining from Ebrietas's perspective. She shared her blood and her knowledge with these humans. The humans used what she gave them to create things that are neither human nor Great One, to pursue an agenda that served the Church's interests rather than Ebrietas's. The choir saw Ebrietas as a resource, as the access point to the knowledge they needed. Whether Ebrietas understood this, whether she knew she was being used rather than befriended, is another unknowable. If she did know and engaged anyway, the loneliness implied by that choice is enormous. The upper cathedral ward, by the time the player arrives, is a disaster. The celestial mob creatures, the transformed students, the various experiments gone wrong, are everywhere. The choir's pursuit of Great One knowledge, using what Ebrietas gave them, has produced this. And at the centre of it all, still praying at the altar, is the being who started the chain by choosing to share. She is not responsible for what the choir did with her gifts, but the connection between her openness and the disaster around her is one of the game's quieter ironies. The One Reborn, a boss found later in the game, in the lecture building area of the nightmare, is described as a product of choir ritual, a mass of human bodies formed into a single entity. This is the choir's interpretation of the resurrection power that the altar of despair represents, the power that Ebrietas has access to. They created a thing that is technically alive in the most mechanical sense, technically undying in a grotesque way, and called it a success. Ebrietas prays for genuine contact with the cosmos. The choir built a pile of bodies. The gap between intention and outcome is the size of the cathedral itself. One of the item descriptions for choir items mentions being messengers of the left behind. The choir position themselves as the representatives of Ebrietas, as the people who would speak on behalf of the Great One, who did not ascend. This framing is telling because it inverts the usual dynamic. Normally humans are trying to reach the Great Ones. The choir claim to be carrying the Great One's message downward, into the world, on Ebrietas' behalf. Whether Ebrietas endorsed this representation, whether she even knew it was happening, is unclear. The tears remain the most important detail. When a fight happens in Bloodborne, it is usually between the player and something that exists as an obstacle. Even the tragic enemies, the cleric beasts, the transformed hunters, are primarily obstacles that the game asks you to overcome. Ebrietas' weeping changes the register of the encounter. She is not purely an obstacle. She is a being having an experience, and the experience includes grief. And the grief is visible, and you are in the middle of causing it whether you mean to or not. This is one of the places where Bloodborne's design is doing something that most games do not attempt, making the mandatory violence feel genuinely costly in emotional terms rather than just in mechanical terms. You can heal from the damage Ebrietas deals. You cannot heal from understanding what the tears mean. After the fight, the cathedral is still there. The altar is still there. The blood on the floor is Ebrietas's, and the cosmos that she was praying toward has not answered and will not answer, and was probably never going to answer. She was left behind, and she prayed and she tried to share what she knew, and she wept, and then she died. This is her story. As much as anything in this game constitutes a story, it is not a comfortable one. But then, nothing about the great ones is comfortable. They are too large for comfort, too strange for it, too ancient for it. The most we can do is try to see them clearly, and to understand that what looks like a monster from one angle might look like a mourner from another, and that both views can be true at the same time. Chapter 6. The Moon Presence. The Moon Presence is the final boss of two of the game's three endings, and in some readings of the lore it is the primary architect of everything the player has been experiencing since the beginning of the game. It is the being that created or maintains the hunter's dream. It is the being that formed the pact with Yharnam, binding him to the dream as the first hunter, the gardener, and guide for every hunter who comes after. It is the being that sits in the true ending at the top of the stairs in the hunter's dream and reveals itself when the player refuses to accept Yharnam's offer of mercy. The Moon Presence is striking in its visual design in a way that is different from most of the other great ones. It is not enormous in the way that Ebrietas or the Wet Nurse are enormous. It is tall and thin and pale, with a face that is not quite a face, and limbs that articulate in ways that limbs should not. It moves with a kind of terrible elegance. It is less like an animal and more like a ceremony, like the embodiment of an occasion, and the occasion it embodies is the hunt. The blood hunt is the Moon Presence's agenda, as far as we can tell. The hunt serves a function that is not immediately clear, but that becomes clearer as the lore is assembled. The hunt generates blood echoes. Blood echoes are the game's currency, the experiential residue of violence, accumulated through killing and lost on death. They circulate through the dream, through the system the Moon Presence maintains, in a way that serves the Moon Presence's needs. Whether those needs are nutritional in some sense, whether blood echoes are literally consumed by the Moon Presence, or whether they serve some other function, is one of the lore's open questions. The pact with Yharnam is the foundation of everything. Yharnam was a great hunter, possibly the greatest hunter of his age, before the dream. He was human or fully human, without the modifications and transformations that the later stages of the hunt produce. He met the Moon Presence, or was found by the Moon Presence, at some point during the height of the Beast Plague, and the meeting produced an arrangement. Yharnam would be the caretaker of the dream, the trainer of hunters, the man who sends them back into the waking world and receives them when they return. In exchange, the hunt would continue. In exchange, the Moon Presence would have a mechanism for producing blood echoes indefinitely. Yharnam did not understand what he was agreeing to, or perhaps he understood some of it and not all of it. He believed, or came to believe, that he was serving a higher purpose, that the hunt was genuinely protecting Yharnam, that the sacrifices were worth it. By the time the player meets him, he has been in the dream for an immeasurable span of time. He is old, he is tired, he is not certain that any of it was worth it. The wheelchair, the flowers, the gentle voice are all markers of someone who has been doing something terrible for too long and is still trying to find meaning in it. The Moon Presence has been feeding off this cycle. The hunter dies, the hunter returns, the hunter kills more beasts, accumulates more echoes, dies again. The dream resets, the cycle continues. It is a beautifully efficient machine for producing the thing the Moon Presence wants, and Yharnam is the engine of it. And he agreed to be the engine, and he cannot stop being the engine, because the dream is the Moon Presence's space, and leaving the dream is not something Yharnam gets to choose. The doll complicates things. The doll in the hunter's dream is a recreation of a woman from Gehrman's past, built by Gehrman and animated, presumably, by the moon presence's influence in the dream. She is warm and kind and patient and slightly uncanny. She exists to make the dream feel livable, to give the hunter something to relate to soften the experience of waking up dead in a place that is not quite a place. She is, in the most direct sense, the moon presence's tool for keeping hunters comfortable enough to keep going back. Gehrman has complicated feelings about the doll, as his dialogue makes clear. He misses the woman she was made to resemble. He is not sure what the doll herself is. She is not the woman, she is a sculpture of the woman animated to serve a function, and he has to live with this imperfect comfort every day in the dream because the dream has no other comfort to offer. The moon presence gave him something that looks like what he lost, and the looking like is the cruelty at the centre of it. The moon presence itself does not appear in the hunter's dream under ordinary circumstances. It watches from elsewhere. The dream is its remote system, its carefully maintained farm. The watcher needs no direct presence in the field to benefit from the harvest. It is only when the player has collected 3 umbilical cords and expanded their awareness beyond what the dream's concealment can contain that the moon presence must appear directly, that the hidden manager of the system is forced to show itself. The fight with the moon presence is one of the game's more unusual encounters mechanically. The moon presence drains the player's HP to a single point with one of its moves, a devastating and terrifying ability. But the fight is beatable. The moon presence is not the impenetrable cosmic entity it presents itself as. It can be hurt, it bleeds the same as everything else in this game bleeds. The cosmic horror is not invulnerable. It is simply very large and very old and very capable of harm, and those properties do not make something immortal. What happens after the fight in the game's true ending is the most genuinely strange moment in a genuinely strange game. The player character, who has consumed the 3 umbilical cords, who has expanded beyond the human, who has defeated the being that was running the cycle, dissolves. They become something new. They become a small, pale, many-armed infant, a great one of a sort, cradled by the doll in the garden of the dream. Gehrman weeps over this. The doll is calm. This is an ascension. It is what Willem wanted, what Lawrence wanted, what Mikolash wanted. And it is also a death of sorts, the death of whatever the player character was, transformed into something that can only exist in the space the dream occupies. Whether this is good or bad, whether the transformed player is better off or worse off than they were, is the game's central ambiguity, and it refuses to resolve it. The moon presence's defeat does not destroy the dream. The doll remains, the garden remains, the infant player remains in it. What changes is the management structure. Without the moon presence running the cycle, the dream exists as a place rather than as a machine. Whether the infant player will eventually grow into something that imposes its own will on the dream, that becomes the next manager of the cycle, is a question the game ends before answering. The moon presence chose Yharnam, or it chose the situation in Yharnam, the particular confluence of the blood and the beast plague and the human desperation to overcome both. The hunt is the mechanism it built to exploit that confluence. But why Yharnam specifically? Why this particular city on this particular night? Why Gehrman rather than some other hunter? These questions are not answerable. The moon presence does not explain itself. It does not have a perspective that translates into explanation. One reading of the moon presence is that it is neither good nor evil, but genuinely indifferent, running the cycle for reasons that make sense in terms of its own nature, but carry no malice toward the humans it uses. Another reading is that the dream, the trap, the comfortable garden that keeps hunters hunting, is a deliberately cruel construct, that the moon presence understood exactly what it was doing to Gehrman, and did it anyway with full awareness of the harm. The game supports both readings. The choice between them may come down to what you think consciousness requires. If consciousness requires awareness of consequences and the ability to weigh them morally, then the moon presence may simply lack the equipment for cruelty. If consciousness is a broader category that includes beings that act from need without ethical framework, then cruelty is possible without being the same thing it is for humans. Either way, the dream existed. Gehrman suffered in it. The hunters died in it again and again, and woke up and went back, and the cycle continued, and somewhere behind the moon presence watched and waited and fed on whatever the cycle produces. This is the architecture of the world the player wakes up into at the start of the game. The player does not know this. Nobody tells them. They wake up in a clinic, they get bitten by a beast, they find their way out into the streets, and they start fighting. The context that explains everything they're fighting through is not revealed until much later, and even then only partially, and the moon presence at the center of the web is not visible until the very end. The timing of the moon presence's appearance in relation to Mergo's existence is interesting. Mergo's Great One cry, amplified by the Mensis ritual, is what accelerated the blood moon and the general crisis of the game's single night. The moon presence benefits from this crisis in that the accelerated madness and violence produces more echoes faster. But the crisis is also potentially dangerous to the moon presence's operation. If the city is completely destroyed, if there are no more hunters, the system stops working. The moon presence has an interest in the crisis being productive rather than terminal. This gives the moon presence a stake in the player's success, not in the player's survival exactly, but in the player's continued function as a hunter. The dream keeps returning the player to the lamp after each death, not as a kindness, but as a maintenance of the resource. The moon presence needs the player to keep going. The comfortable dream, the patient doll, the gradually improving equipment available through the workshop, all of this is infrastructure for keeping the resource productive. The moon presence is the most human of the great ones in one specific sense. It has an agenda that can be named. It wants something, and it built a system to get it. This makes it more comprehensible than Uiden or Rom or Ebrietas. It also makes it, in a way, more culpable. Beings that act from nature without agenda cannot be held responsible for their effects. A being that builds a system, that makes a pact, that designs a comfortable trap, is doing something that implies a kind of intentionality. Whether the moon presence has enough of that intentionality to be genuinely responsible is the question. It comes down to the dream. The dream was made. Something made it. The making required decisions about what to include, how to make it comfortable, who to put in it. These decisions produced Gehrman's suffering. Whether the being that made those decisions had any understanding of what suffering was, had any ability to weigh Gehrman's suffering against whatever benefit the arrangement produced, is the pivot point of the entire moral question. And Bloodborne, being Bloodborne, will not answer it for you. The moon presence is the end of the hunt and the beginning of what comes after. And what comes after is the infant in the garden, and the doll watching over it, and the dream going on without its architect, and the question of what an ascended hunter becomes, if given enough time and enough space. The moon watches. It always has. Chapter 7. Amygdala. Amygdala is everywhere and nowhere for most of the game. The creatures that cling to the buildings of Yharnam, enormous and angular and impossible in their scale, are amygdalae. They are visible only to those with enough insight to see them. Below a certain threshold of accumulated knowledge, they are simply not there to the eye, even though they are physically present. This is one of the clearest demonstrations of the game's rule that knowledge changes what you can perceive, that the world looks different, depending on how much of it you're capable of seeing. The word amygdala comes from anatomy. In the human brain, the amygdala are almond-shaped structures in the temporal lobes that are associated with emotional processing, particularly with fear. The naming choice is clearly intentional. The beings that are only visible to those who know enough to fear them are named after the brain structure that processes fear. The game is suggesting that seeing amygdala is itself an experience of the mind registering something that triggers the fear response, and that the brain structure responsible for that response has a correspondence in the Great One, being of the same name. There are amygdalae throughout the game's spaces. In the nightmare spaces, they appear more frequently and in more varied forms. In the nightmare frontier, an amygdala is the boss, a long creature that clutches the player and performs arcane attacks from range. The fight takes place in an open, misty landscape, and the amygdala's scale in this setting is clarifying. It is enormous, not in the way that Ebrietas is enormous, filling a cathedral, in the way that a natural feature is enormous, occupying the landscape the way a cliff or a body of water occupies it. The specific amygdala in the nightmare frontier drops the ailing Loran chalice, connecting it to the Loran region, a civilization that predates or parallels Yharnam in certain respects, and that was also destroyed by the Beast Plague. Loran is represented in the game primarily through the Chalice dungeons, where Loran-themed dungeons offer their own enemies and bosses and lore fragments. The amygdala's connection to Loran suggests that the amygdalae have been present in the world longer than Yharnam's particular crisis, that they are not a phenomenon specific to the Blood Moon Night, but are a persistent feature of the world at the level of awareness the game describes as having insight. The amygdalae on Yharnam's buildings are passive during the Blood Moon in most of the game. They observe, they cling. They do not attack unless the player directly interacts with one specific amygdala in a specific way, the hand that appears in certain locations and teleports the player to the hunter's nightmare. This is a form of interaction. It is not friendly, exactly, but it is not hostile either. The amygdala is providing access to a space. Whether it is doing this deliberately, whether it has any awareness of the service it is providing, is open. The hunter's nightmare is the DLC area of the game, accessible through the amygdala's arm. It is another nightmare space, this one built from the history of Yharnam's hunters and the atrocity committed in the fishing hamlet. The amygdala serves as the portal because amygdalae have a connection to the nightmare spaces, to the threshold between the world and the dream, that other beings do not. They exist at the boundary. They are the boundary, in a sense, or the doors in the boundary. The amygdala in the research hall, visible through a window, has a very specific relationship to the events of the DLC. The research hall is where the patients of the astral clock tower were kept, the women who underwent experiments that were meant to expand their consciousness toward the Great Ones. The amygdala observed these experiments. Whether it participated, whether its observation was an act of mercy or of appetite, is not specified, but it was there, watching through the window, as the women had their awareness systematically expanded, and the expansion drove them mad. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower is the DLC's most significant character, a hunter of extraordinary skill who became the caretaker of the clock tower patients and who committed suicide when she could no longer bear what she had been part of, specifically the events in the fishing hamlet. Her death did not release her. She continues to exist in the nightmare, continuing to perform her function as a guardian of the tower, continuing to protect the patients she could not save in life. The amygdala is present in this space, watching all of this, as it presumably has been since the catastrophe that created the nightmare. The amygdala's role in the game's broader structure is as witnesses and doorways. They see what humans cannot see. They know things that humans cannot know, because they exist at a level of reality where knowledge of this kind is simply part of existence. They do not use this knowledge to help or to hinder in any consistent way. They simply have it. The amygdala in the lecture hall of the nightmare space stands at the end of a corridor and looks down at the player approaching. It does not attack. It watches. This watching is one of the game's most unsettling images because it implies an audience, implies that everything happening in the game is being observed by beings who understand it better than anyone playing it. The amygdala as a category of Great One, rather than a single individual, is suggested by the sheer number of them visible throughout the game. They cannot all be the same being. They are either the same type of being, a species or a variety of Great One that occurs in multiples, or they are aspects of a single larger consciousness distributed across multiple physical forms. Either interpretation is possible, and neither can be ruled out with the available lore. The name amygdala, applied by the humans who name these beings, may be less a description of the beings themselves and more a description of what seeing them does to the human brain. The fear response, the recognition of something too large and too other to process comfortably. The brain structure that handles this recognition has given its name to the thing that activates it. This is naming by effect rather than by nature, which is appropriate for beings whose nature is not accessible to the humans naming them. The arcane attacks that the Nightmare Frontier amygdala uses involve beams of light from the sky and from its eyes. These attacks suggest a connection to the stellar plane that the Great Ones are generally associated with. The light comes from above. The amygdala channels it downward. Whether this is a weapon or a communication, or simply what happens when the amygdala uses its native capabilities in a threatening context is not clear. But the directionality is consistent with the game's broader cosmology. The Great Ones connect upward, to the stars, to the cosmos, and this connection can be expressed as light that burns. The amygdala's presence in Yharnam is ancient. They were there before the Beast Plague, before the Healing Church, possibly before the city itself. The Pethumerians in the deepest levels of the Chalice dungeons had contact with beings that may have been amygdalae. The deep stone of the oldest dungeons has carvings that could represent these angular forms. If amygdalae have been present in and around the Pethumerian world for as long as the civilization existed, then they are not visitors or invaders. They are features of the landscape at the level of awareness required to see them. What amygdalae want, if they want anything, is one of the lore's more impenetrable questions. They do not pursue, they do not herd, they do not communicate, except through the functionality of the arm portal that delivers players to the hunter's nightmare. They observe. They cling to buildings in poses that suggest attention directed towards something, though what that something is cannot be identified from the player's position. They are the Great Ones as pure witness, as entities defined more by their perception than by their action. The nightmare that the arm portal leads to is instructive, because it implies that amygdalae have both awareness of and access to the nightmare spaces. They are not trapped in the nightmare the way that the hunters in the hunter's nightmare are trapped. They exist on both sides of the boundary that separates the nightmare from the waking world. This makes them liminal in a very specific way, not belonging fully to either space, maintaining a form on each side of the divide. The physical form clinging to the buildings of Yharnam is the waking world expression. Whatever they are in the nightmare is the other expression. The amygdala in the Nightmare Frontier drops the ailing Lauren chalice, and this is one of those details that, followed carefully, reveals the scope of what the amygdalae have witnessed. Lauren is gone. The civilization is destroyed. But the amygdala carries something of Lauren, something that allows the chalice to be created, that connects this being to the ruins of a world that fell to the same kind of catastrophe that is consuming Yharnam right now. The amygdala saw Lauren. The amygdala is still here. The amygdala will likely still be here after Yharnam falls. This persistence is unsettling in a specific way. The amygdalae are not invested in Yharnam's survival. They are not trying to save it or destroy it. They are watching it, as they watch Loran, as they have presumably watched other civilizations before Loran that the game does not name. They are the audience for a kind of tragedy that repeats, that follows a pattern that the amygdalae have had occasion to observe multiple times. The pattern is, a civilization finds the blood opens the mind opens too far, the beast plague comes, the civilization falls. Yharnam is not the first, it is the current. The amygdalae see this clearly, from their position at the boundary, with their insight that is beyond anything a human can accumulate. They cling to the buildings, and they watch, and they do not intervene, because intervening is not what they do. They are the eyes in the dark, the unblinking audience, the beings who will be there to witness the ending, whatever the ending is, and who will still be there afterward, clinging to whatever remains of the buildings, if any buildings remain. One specific reading of the amygdala in the research hall is that it was the object of study rather than the observer, that the experiments performed on the clock tower patients were intended to expand their awareness to the point where they could perceive and communicate with the amygdala visible through the window. Whether this worked, whether any of the patients achieved actual contact before the expansion destroyed them, is not known. But the amygdala's presence just outside the window of a research facility dedicated to expanding human perception toward the great ones is not coincidental. The relationship between amygdala and fear, between the brain structure and the cosmic being, circles back to something important. Fear, in the biological sense, is a response to the presence of something that threatens the organism. The amygdala in the brain fire when the threat is registered, regardless of whether the organism can fully process what the threat is. The amygdala in the game trigger the same response in the player. The recognition of something vast and threatening, the visceral, physical response to wrongness at a scale that the mind struggles to contain. This is, in its own strange way, appropriate. The great ones are not supposed to be comfortable. They are not supposed to be containable. The fear response is the correct response. The game is using a cognitive structure, the brain's fear center, as the name for the thing that the fear response exists to process. It is saying, this is what you were always afraid of. This is what the fear was always about under everything else, something enormous at the edge of perception that has been watching all along. Chapter 8, The Celestial Emissary and Cause. The Celestial Emissary is both a boss encounter and a representation of something the Healing Church was attempting to build. A being that could serve as a messenger between humans and great ones. The word emissary means envoy, one who is sent on a mission, and the celestial emissary is the Church's attempt to create something that had been deliberately sent, shaped for the purpose of contact, rather than a human who stumbled into contact through the usual catastrophic means. The result is a room full of blue glowing humanoids, and one of them that grows large when engaged. A fight that is among the stranger encounters in the game because it comes after a walk through the upper cathedral where everything has already gone wrong in interesting ways. The celestial emissary represents the end point of a specific research program. The choir was trying to raise humanity toward the cosmos, to create beings that had enough great one quality to communicate upward, while retaining enough human quality to be comprehensible downward. What they produced was the celestial mob, the celestial emissary, the glowing blue things that wander the upper cathedral. These beings are not successfully elevated. They are not ambassadors. They are something in between two states without the stability of either. They glow. They cluster. The emissary grows large in a fight. They have properties that are not human, but they also do not appear to have access to the higher plane that the choir was trying to reach. They are stranded in the middle, which is exactly where the choir's experiments tended to leave people. The Orphan of Kos is something different. The Orphan of Kos is the final boss of the DLC, and it is one of the most emotionally loaded fights in the game, because by the time you reach it, you have assembled the story of what happened in the fishing hamlet. The fishing hamlet was a coastal village inhabited by people who had a relationship with Kos, the Great One of the Sea, or the Great One washed ashore, or the Great One who existed at the boundary between the ocean and the land. Kos is dead when the events relevant to the player's story take place. She is lying on the shore of the fishing hamlet, enormous and pale and clearly deceased, but not gone in the way that most dead things are gone. Her body continues to generate Kos parasites, the small creatures that inhabit the blood of the hamlet's people. Her presence is still felt throughout the area, even though her body is still. The people of the fishing hamlet are caught in a nightmare because of what the hunters did to their home. The hunters, specifically Gehrman and the hunters under him, came to the hamlet and performed what the law suggests was a massacre, killing the villagers to harvest their blood and to access Kos, or what remained of Kos. Lady Maria participated. This is the act she cannot forgive herself for. The reason she killed herself in the nightmare. The shadow over every aspect of her characterization. They killed people who had done nothing wrong except live near a Great One and develop a culture around that proximity. The Orphan of Kos is born from Kos's body during the player's confrontation. It emerges from her and stands, a pale, veined, screaming thing with enormous wings, and it fights with a frenzy that is immediately legible as grief. It is a newborn, screaming from its first moment of existence, already orphaned, already in a world where its parent is dead, and the people who killed her are the ones standing in front of it. The fight is brutal. The orphan is relentless. The sound design of the fight is some of the most affecting in the game. The connection between the orphan and the umbrella cord is direct. The orphan is exactly the kind of Great One's child that the umbilical cord items represent, but where Mergo is a distant presence in a nightmare, something felt rather than seen. The orphan is immediately present, physical, visible, screaming, the same tragedy rendered at a different scale and with a different texture. The curse of the fishing hamlet, described in the dialogue of one of the NPCs, is the source of the hunter's nightmare. The hunters who committed the atrocity at the hamlet were cursed by Kos, or by the fisherman in her name, or by the blood of the people killed, to be trapped forever in a nightmare built from their crime. The hunter's nightmare is a warped version of Yharnam, full of hunters who have been there so long they have lost their minds, who attack anything that moves, who have been paying for what they did in the only currency the nightmare accepts, suffering without end. This is a version of justice that is also a Great One consequence. Kos, dying or dead, cursed the hunters. The curse took the form of a nightmare. The nightmare is a place between the world and the dream, maintained by the weight of the crime, rather than by any active management. It runs on guilt the way the hunter's dream runs on blood echoes, and the orphan is at the centre of it, born into the crime, inheriting the grief, inheriting the nightmare. The final moment of the orphan fight, when the orphan is defeated, has the orphan look up. It looks at the sky, it makes a sound, and then it falls. Whether what it sees in the sky is Kos, the dead Great One, reaching across whatever distance separates the living world from wherever Great Ones go after dying, is one of those moments the game gives you without annotation. You can take it as a reunion, as the orphan finally able to reach its mother. You can take it as the orphan simply looking up at the sea sky that is all it has ever known. Either reading is supported by the image. The curse is lifted after the orphan dies. The fisherman's spirits in the hamlet can rest. Simon the Harrowed, who has spent his time in the nightmare, trying to help hunters reach the truth of what happened, can rest. The nightmare does not disappear, but the thing that kept it anchored, the orphan waiting to be born so it could be born in grief, is no longer there. The nightmare loses its centre and eventually, presumably, dissipates. Kos herself is worth sitting with for a moment. She is the Great One who was washed ashore, who died on the beach, whose blood sustained the hamlet for generations. The Kos parasites are passed through the blood of the hamlet's people. The people of the hamlet had a relationship with Kos that was different from any other human Great One relationship in the game. It was not based on research, not based on medicine, not based on a church or a school or a ritual. It was based on proximity and time. Kos arrived. The hamlet was there. Something developed between them over generations. Whatever Kos was before she arrived at the hamlet is not knowable. The game presents her as already on the shore, already in the process of dying or already dead. Whether she chose to be there, whether something brought her there, whether the shore was the end point of a journey, or simply where she happened to be when her existence ended, is open. What is not open is that she was there, and she was a great one, and her presence was foundational for the community that grew up around her. The hunters destroyed that community in the name of research. In the name of getting closer to the Great Ones, they killed the people who had the closest, non-catastrophic relationship with a Great One that the game describes. This is a specific and pointed irony. The pursuit of Great One contact by violence destroyed the one example of Great One contact by coexistence. After the hamlet, there is no model left for what a sustainable relationship with a Great One might look like. There is only the blood and the nightmare and the price of knowing. The orphan's first scream, the first sound it makes when it emerges from Kos's body, is one of the game's most memorable audio moments. It is a sound of pure, unmediated grief, a being's first moment in the world, coinciding with the recognition that it is already in a world of loss. This is the condition of every Great One's child that the game describes. Born into absence, born into the space where the connection should be, born crying. And so we end where the Great Ones end, or where this particular story of the Great Ones ends, on a beach, with a dead god in the water, and a creature screaming at a sky that will not answer, and hunters who have been paying for a crime that they cannot undo, and a nightmare built from grief that is just barely, finally beginning to lift. The night is almost over, the lamps are still lit, and this is where the Great Ones leave us. You said, continue, 12:26. Claude responded, Chapter 9, The Fishing Hamlet and the Legacy of Kos. The fishing hamlet is small. That is the first thing to understand about it. It is a coastal village, a cluster of buildings at the edge of the sea, with boats that no longer go out and nets that no longer pull anything in. By the time the player arrives in the Hunter's Nightmare version of the hamlet, the village has been dying for a very long time. The nightmare has preserved it in the way that nightmares preserve things. Not intact, not functional, but recognizable. The shapes of what it was are still there. The people are still there in a sense as the deformed fishermen who attack the player on sight. The memory of what happened is everywhere, in the architecture, in the water, in the blood that pools in the lower areas near where Kos lies on the shore. What the fishing hamlet was before the hunters came is only suggested, never described directly. The item descriptions and the NPC dialogue fill in the outline rather than the detail. The people who lived there were, by all available evidence, ordinary people. They fished. They had a culture shaped by proximity to the sea. They had, over generations, absorbed something of Kos into their blood through the Kos parasites, and this absorption gave them qualities that were unusual but not monstrous. They were different from the people of Yharnam. They had a relationship to the deep sea, and to what lived in it that Yharnam scholars and hunters did not have and could not replicate in a laboratory. The Kos parasite item, when equipped as a weapon by the hunter, allows the use of arcane attacks that emit writhing tentacle-like energy. The description says that the parasite seems to still be alive, still responding, still connected to something. This persistence of connection after death is consistent with the broader principle that Great One influence does not simply stop when the Great One's body stops functioning. Kos is dead on the shore, but her blood is still active in the hamlet's people, or was active before the massacre, and the parasites are still capable of channeling whatever it is they channel. The fishermen in the nightmare hamlet use their fists and simple tools. They are not equipped like hunters. They are not trained like hunters. They are people who have been transformed by their time in the nightmare, corrupted by the same accumulation of exposure and grief that corrupts everything in the nightmare spaces. But they are still recognizably what they were, ordinary people caught in something that was not their fault. Killing them is necessary. It is also uncomfortable in a way that killing beast plague victims is not, because the beast plague at least provides a frame in which the violence feels medically necessary. The fishermen were not sick. They were murdered and then trapped, and now they die again. Simon the Harrowed is one of the few NPCs who has voluntarily entered the hunter's nightmare, and is trying to navigate it with some purpose. He is a hunter, but not in the usual mould. He is quieter, more uncertain, more aware of the moral weight of what hunting involves. He came to the nightmare looking for answers about what the hunters did at the hamlet, about the atrocity that created the curse. He found more than he could comfortably hold. His questline ends in the way that most questlines in Bloodborne end, which is to say, badly, but badly in a way that carries meaning. His perspective on the hamlet is the closest thing the game provides to a conscience on the subject. He does not excuse what was done. He does not argue that the knowledge gained was worth the cost. He simply acknowledges that it happened, and that the curse that followed from it was a proportionate response, and that the hunters who survive in the nightmare are paying a price that is appropriate, if not merciful. This is a remarkable thing to have an NPC say in a game about hunting, and it is the reason Simon is one of the more memorable characters in a game full of memorable characters. The building in the hamlet that contains the celestial larvae, the small creatures that become the celestial emissary adjacent beings elsewhere in the game, is a detail that connects the hamlet to the broader research program of the Healing Church. The church did not simply come to the hamlet to kill. They came because the hamlet had something they wanted: the parasites, the connection to Kos, the blood of people who had lived in contact with a Great One for generations and had absorbed that contact into their bodies without going mad. This was scientifically interesting to them. The horror of this framing is specific and worth naming. The church researchers looked at the people of the fishing hamlet and saw research subjects. They saw bodies containing information they wanted access to. The massacre was not a side effect of the research. In this reading, the massacre was the research, the most efficient way to extract what the bodies contained. Lady Maria understood this, participated in it, and then could not live with the understanding. Gehrman presumably managed his understanding differently. His long imprisonment in the dream may be partly a consequence of what was done at the hamlet. A debt the moon presence and the nightmare are collecting in slow installments. Kos's relationship to the sea is one of the things that distinguishes her from the other Great Ones in the game. Most Great Ones in Bloodborne are connected to the cosmos, to the stars, to the upper sky. Ebrietas reaches toward the cosmos. The moon presence is associated with the moon. Mergo is in a nightmare that floats above the city in the dream architecture. Kos is below. She is connected to the deep ocean, to what lives in the water rather than what lives in the sky. This inversion is aesthetically significant. The sky-reaching Great Ones are about ascension, about lifting the human toward the divine. Kos is about depth, about what is found by going down rather than up. The deep ocean in Bloodborne's world has its own cosmological weight. The Loran civilization had a connection to something beneath the earth rather than above it, and Loran's fall was connected to the same blood and beast dynamic that is consuming Yharnam. The ocean-deep earth axis that Kos and Loran represent may be a parallel to the sky-cosmos axis that the Healing Church represents, two different directions toward the same fundamental category of thing. the great ones, wherever they happen to be encountered. The fishing hamlet's version of Great One Contact is the most human the game presents. There is no ritual, there is no church, there is no research program. There is a dead god on a beach and people who live near the beach for long enough that the god became part of them. The integration is biological, through the parasites, but the character of it is almost domestic. Kos was there. The people were there. Something passed between them over time. This is not mysticism. It is proximity and duration producing something that looks a little like relationship. What the church did when they came was to impose the research and extraction model on something that operated by a different logic entirely. The hamlet did not have the blood medicine. The hamlet did not have the ascension program. The hamlet had a god on the shore, and generations of living with what that meant. The church, encountering this, converted it immediately into terms their model could use, and in doing so, destroyed the model that was actually working. The Kos parasite as a weapon is one of the more interesting design choices in the DLC. The player can use something extracted from the bodies of the hamlet's people, something connected to the dead Great One on the shore, as a tool for the rest of the content. This creates a mechanical complicity. The player is using what the church extracted, using it in the same context of violence that produced the nightmare. The game does not comment on this. It simply makes it available and lets the player decide whether to use it. The shore where Kos lies is the most visually affecting location in the game. The sky is wrong, a grey-orange that suggests neither day nor night, but something between. The water is still. The body is enormous, pale, beached. The sounds are those of the sea and of nothing else, because everything that lived near that shore is either dead or trapped in the nightmare version above. The shore is a graveyard, and Kos is the centerpiece of it, and the orphan will be born from her body, and the whole geography is a portrait of what a world looks like after the worst thing has already happened. Standing near Kos before the orphan fight, before the player has triggered the boss, there is a moment of stillness that the game affords. The body is just there. The water moves, the sky is wrong, and somewhere in or near the body, something is waiting to be born into the worst possible circumstances. The game holds this image long enough for it to register before the fight begins, and that restraint, that willingness to let the tragedy be still for a moment before it becomes action, is one of the things that makes Bloodborne specifically good at what it is trying to do. The people who cursed the hunters were dying when they cursed them. The curse they laid was their last act. The nightmare it produced has been running ever since, catching hunters who came to the city on other nights for other reasons, and pulling them in through the amygdala's arm. These hunters have no connection to the original crime. They were simply hunters, doing what hunters do, and the nightmare took them because the nightmare is not discriminating. It is a consequence that is still running, still collecting, still trapping, long after the people who set it in motion are gone. This is how curses work in the logic of this world. They are not targeted, they are environmental. They persist because the conditions that generated them persist. The dead god on the shore, the unborn child in the body, the grief of a community that was destroyed without warning or justification. As long as these conditions persist, the nightmare persists. The orphan's defeat resolves the central condition, allows the unborn to be born and to grieve and then to rest. The nightmare can then begin to exhaust itself. But Kos is still on the shore. The shore is still wrong. The sky is still the colour of nothing in particular. The bodies of the villagers are still in the water where they fell or were thrown. The evidence of what happened is preserved in the nightmare's architecture, the way that crimes are preserved in the memory of everyone who witnessed them. The nightmare lifting does not mean the crime is undone. It means the most acute consequence has been addressed, and what remains is the record. There is a description somewhere in the DLC material that refers to Kos's grace, to something that Kos bestows or bestowed, something that the hamlet's people carried as a result of their proximity to her. Whatever this grace was, it was real enough that the church wanted it enough to kill for it. The grace did not survive the killing. You cannot extract what is given freely through proximity and duration by forcing it out through violence. The church learned this, or should have learned this, from the results. The massacre produced parasites and research material and a curse. It did not produce the connection that the hamlet's people had. That connection died with them. This is the final lesson of the fishing hamlet. The knowledge the church sought could not be taken. It had to be grown slowly over generations in the specific conditions that the hamlet provided. The church's hunger for faster results, the same hunger that made Lawrence choose the blood medicine over Willem's slower intellectual ascension, destroyed the only example of what slow, careful contact with a great one could produce. And the cost of that destruction is everything the hunter's nightmare contains. The hunters in the nightmare, who have lost their minds, who have been there long enough to become as monstrous as the thing they used to hunt, are not being punished for their individual crimes. Most of them were not at the hamlet. They are caught in a consequence that is larger than any individual action. This is justice at a scale that does not care about individual culpability. The nightmare does not care who you are. It cares about what hunting is, what it has always been, and what the hunting that happened at the hamlet represents at the limit of what hunting can become. The fishing hamlet is, at its deepest level, the game's argument about the relationship between knowledge and violence. Every other arc in Bloodborne involves knowledge sought through a kind of violence, the violence of the blood, which transforms the body and destroys the mind, the violence of the ritual, which forces contact that was not freely given, the violence of the hunt itself, which manages the consequences of these other violences through the production of more violence. The hamlet is the argument against all of these, the example of what happens when knowledge is not sought through violence, when contact develops through time and proximity, and the argument is made by showing what happens when the violent model encounters the non-violent one. It wins, the violent model wins, it kills the hamlet and extracts what it can and moves on. But it also in winning produces the curse, produces the nightmare, produces the orphan and the scream and the sky that will not answer. The victory is complete, and it is also a catastrophe, and both things are true at the same time, and the game holds them both without flinching. That is the fishing hamlet. That is Kos. That is what is at the bottom of the coastal stairs in the hunter's nightmare, past the fisherman and the blood and the wrong sky, a dead god on a beach and the silence that follows the worst thing you can imagine, and the tide coming in. Chapter 10. The Pthumerian. Great Ones and the Deep Dungeons. The Chalice Dungeons are the oldest layer of everything. Before Yharnam, before the Healing Church, before Birkenwerth, before even the civilization that built the buildings the player walks through in the early game, there were the dungeons. The Pthumerians built them, or found them, and extended them, over a span of time that the game does not quantify, but that is clearly immense. The stone at the deepest levels looks different from the stone higher up. The carvings are different, the enemies are different, the atmosphere is different in a way that is difficult to articulate, but immediately felt. The deepest dungeons feel genuinely ancient in a way that the rest of the game, which also feels ancient, does not quite reach. The great ones accessible through the deepest chalice dungeons include Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, who we have already discussed in the context of Mergo, and Abhorrent Beast and Living Failures, and at the very bottom, the Pthumerian Descendant and Bloodletting Beast, and the final boss of the Root Dungeons. But the great ones connected to the deepest lore of the dungeons, the ones that the Pthumerians were building their civilization around, are less specific bosses and more presences, the thing that the blood comes from, the thing that the rituals address, the thing that the architecture of the dungeons is oriented toward reaching. The Eye's Chalice dungeons are the ones most directly connected to the cosmic Great Ones, to Ebrietas, and to whatever exists at the boundary between the physical world and the higher plane. The Eye's material, the white stone with blue accents, is visually distinct from the darker Thumerian stone and from the rough Loran material. It is cleaner, more geometric, more alien. The enemies in Eyes are often celestial, the blue glowing humanoids connected to the choir's experiments. These beings in the ice chalices are older than the choir, or at least older than the choir's versions of them, suggesting that the celestial type has existed for longer than the church's research program. The watchdog of the Old Lords and the bloodletting beast are the two chalice dungeon bosses that are most clearly connected to the Thumerian relationship, with something that is not quite a great one, but not quite a beast either. These are transformations, bodies that have been so thoroughly saturated with old blood that they have become something other than what they were. The Old Lords of the title are the Thumerians, at their most transformed, the rulers of the civilization at its deepest and most blood-saturated level. One reading of the deep dungeons is that the Thumerians at the bottom of the civilization were in a state of extended contact with the Great Ones that transformed them over generations into something that is no longer quite human. The Descendant, the Queen, the various powerful beings encountered in the chalices are these transformed Thumerians, people who spent long enough close enough to the source that the distance between human and Great One became less absolute for them. Whether this is ascension in the way that Willem and Lawrence dreamed of is unclear. It looks more like absorption than elevation. The Ebrietas connection to the Eye's chalices is specific. She was found there. The choir discovered her in the Great Is Chalice dungeon, not in the upper city, not in Yharnam itself. This suggests Ebrietas had been in the deep dungeons or had access to the deep dungeons before the choir came looking. Whether she was hiding, whether she was drawn there by what the dungeons represented in the cosmological landscape, or whether she simply found herself there as a consequence of being left behind and needing somewhere to go, is not specified. The chalice rituals that the player uses to open dungeons are interesting because they require specific materials that can only be found in the dungeons themselves. The dungeons are self-contained in their requirements. You need dungeon materials to open dungeon doors. This suggests the dungeons operate as a closed system, or nearly closed, a loop in which the materials produced by the dungeon's contents are the only things capable of accessing more of the dungeon. This loop is very old. The Thumerians presumably discovered it the same way the player does, by exploring, finding materials, using them, going deeper. The Thumerian Queen's presence in both the Chalice dungeons and the Mensis Nightmare, as a figure who watches from a window, connects the two deepest narrative threads in the game, the Chalice lore and the Nightmare lore. She is the point where these threads intersect. She bore Mergo, who is in the Nightmare. She is accessible in the dungeons. She exists in both spaces because she is connected to both, to the deep Thumerian tradition of contact with Great Ones, through the blood and the ritual, and to the specific tragedy of a child that could not survive the conditions of its birth. The rituals themselves are worth a moment of attention. They are described in the game as old, older than the church, older than Yharnam, as old as the Thumerian civilization that built the dungeons, but they function. The player performs them in the present tense, and the dungeons open in response. This means the system the Thumerians built is still operational after millennia. The dungeons are still there. The rituals still work. The bosses at the bottoms of the dungeons are still there, still guarding whatever they were always guarding. The whole mechanism has been running without maintenance, without a civilization to maintain it, simply because it was built well enough and connected deeply enough to the fundamental properties of this world that it does not need external support to continue functioning. This is the Thumerian achievement. their actual achievement rather than the tragic ending of their civilization. They built something that lasted. Not their cities, not their culture, not their people, but the dungeons and the rituals and the connection between them and the blood and the great ones at the bottom. That has lasted. It is still here. It will probably still be here after Yharnam falls, after the healing church is gone, after the last hunter has died or ascended or been consumed by the nightmare. The bloodletting beast is one of the more physically extreme transformations in the dungeons. It is enormous, raw, the skin removed from much of the body so that the underlying structure, muscle and bone, and something that might be more than either, is visible. The bloodletting implied by the name is a reference to the practice of releasing blood from the body, a medical practice from certain historical traditions, and a ritual practice in the context of the dungeons. The beast is the limit case of what happens when a body is given over completely to the blood, when the old blood that flows through the dungeons is allowed to do everything it wants to do to a body without any resistance. The enemies in the deepest dungeons have a quality that the surface-level enemies lack. They're quieter, they move less frantically. The beast madness that drives the transformed citizens of Yharnam into frenzied violence is not the same thing that animates the creatures in the deepest chalices. Those creatures have been in the dark for a very long time, absorbing the weight of the Great One presence below them, and that absorption has produced something different from madness, something that looks more like patience, or at least like the absence of urgency. They have nowhere to go and nothing to wait for, and they have been in that state for long enough that it has become their nature. The Great One, at the bottom of everything, the implied presence that the whole Thumerian system was built to reach and the blood comes from, is never directly named or shown in the game. It is suggested. The blood comes from somewhere. The blood that the Thumerians found, refined, distributed, that the healing church weaponized, that flows through every vein in Yharnam and every person who took the medicine. That blood has a source. The source is at the bottom. The dungeons were built to get close to it. The rituals were built to maintain the connection. Whatever it is still there. The blood still comes. The dungeons still function. The system the Thumerians built to manage the connection between the world above and the source below is still operational, and the source is still producing. This is, in the broadest sense, the engine of everything in Bloodborne. Not any specific Great One, not the Moon Presence or Eden or Ebrietas. The blood at the bottom of the oldest possible layer of human Great One contact, still present, still flowing upward through the system, still changing everything it touches. The Thumerians as a people were not destroyed by the Great Ones. The evidence in the dungeons suggests they were destroyed by the same thing that is destroying Yharnam, the blood doing too much to too many people over too long a period. The beast plague has precedents. What is happening in Yharnam on the night of the game is not unprecedented. It has happened before in a different civilization, with a different set of players. The pattern is old. The dungeons remember it. The stone walls of the deepest levels carry the record of what happens when you get close enough to the source, stay close long enough, and build a civilization on the assumption that the closeness can be managed. It cannot be managed. It could not be managed for the Thumerians, and it cannot be managed for Yharnam. The management strategies change. Ritual versus medicine versus research versus religious hierarchy. The outcome does not change. The blood does what the blood does, and the civilization that built itself around the blood eventually becomes the casualty of the thing it was built around. The player descending through the chalice dungeons is performing a kind of archaeological recreation of the original Thumerian descent. They're going down the same stairs, past the same architectural features, fighting things that are in some cases directly continuous with what the Thumerians fought. The tools are different, the context is different, but the descent itself is the same gesture, repeated across the enormous span of time between the first Thumerian, who who went looking for the source, and the hunter doing it now, in the context of a city that has already begun to fall. The point of the descent is not to find anything definitive. The game does not put a clear answer at the bottom. What it puts at the bottom is more of what has been everywhere else: the blood, and the things that the blood produces when it touches a world, and the silence in which all of this has been happening for longer than any human institution has existed to record it. The Thumerians are gone, the dungeons remain, and somewhere at the bottom, older than the rituals built to reach it, older than the civilization built to manage the reaching, the source goes on producing the thing that changed everything. Chapter 11. Kin, Stars and the Cosmos. The kin are a category of enemy in Bloodborne that requires some explanation because they are not a specific Great One, but a category of being associated with the Great Ones, a type of transformation that moves in the direction of the higher plane rather than in the direction of the beast. The beast transformation is animal. It makes people into creatures of muscle and bone and appetite, purely physical, purely immediate. The kin transformation is the opposite. It moves towards something rarefied, towards something that is losing its grounding in the physical world and drifting upward toward the stars. The kin enemies glow. They emit light of various colours, but most often the cold blue that is associated throughout the game with Great One influence and with the cosmos. They are often found in the nightmare spaces, in the lecture building, in the areas connected to Byrgenwerth and the choir's research. They were human in most cases. The transformation that turned them into kin rather than beasts was connected to exposure to Great One knowledge, to the blood in its more refined and concentrated forms, to proximity to actual Great Ones, rather than just to the beast plague. The distinction between kin and beast is one of the game's most interesting conceptual moves. The game presents two possible failure modes for the human mind and body under Great One influence: the beast below, the kin above. One failure goes down into animal appetite and physical power without mental coherence. The other failure goes up into something that has lost too much of its physical nature and too much of its human mental structure to function as either. The kin are not enlightened. They are not ascended in the way that Willem and Lawrence dreamed of. They are human beings who are exposed to too much of the upward direction without the capacity to complete the journey. The celestial mob creatures in the upper cathedral are the choir's version of this failure. The students who underwent whatever process the choir subjected them to did not become Great Ones. They became kin, beings with enough of the upward direction to glow and to exist partially in the stellar register, but not enough to survive there with any coherence. They cluster. They do not communicate. They are defined by what they have lost more than by what they have gained. The Cainhurst Vilebloods are a different expression of something adjacent to the kin category. The Vilebloods are humans who are infused with the blood that came from a Great One more directly than the Church's refined medicine, and this infusion gave them unusual properties. They do not age in the conventional way. They have connections to the pale blood that the Church considers corrupt, and they exist in a political opposition to the healing Church that has been ongoing for generations. The Queen of Cainhurst is one of the most important figures in the background lore, a woman who has been alive through an enormous span of Yharnam's history, because the blood she carries is different from the blood the Church distributes. The stars as a navigational concept in Bloodborne's cosmology point toward the source of the Great Ones, rather than toward the Great Ones themselves. The Great Ones came from somewhere. The game consistently gestures toward the stars, the cosmos, the stellar plane, as the place they came from or the place they are oriented toward. The eye motifs that appear throughout the game, the eyes in the ground, the eyes that appear on transformed hunters, the eyes that are associated with insight are looking upward, looking at the stars. accumulating enough awareness to see in that direction. The lumen flowers that grow toward the moon in the Healing Church's gardens are a botanical expression of this orientation. The flowers are named for their light-seeking behavior, and they seek specifically the light of the moon, the Great One light rather than sunlight. The choir used lumen flower extracts in their research, specifically in the items associated with the celestial mob creatures. The flowers are another example of the world in Bloodborne organizing itself around the Great One presence. Even the plants are oriented toward the stars. The choir bell item, found in Byrgenwerth's master's room, is described as attracting the gaze of the Great Ones from above. The bell is a communication device, a way of getting the attention of something that exists at the stellar level. This is very different from the Mensis cage approach, which invited something in. The bell calls out. Whether the Great Ones respond to the bell in any consistent way, whether the calling out achieves anything, is not specified. But the existence of the item implies that at some point, someone believed they could get the Great One's attention this way. The celestial themes throughout the game's visual design are worth noting in aggregate. The blue glowing enemies, the arcane attacks that come from the sky, the nightmare spaces that seem to float above the normal world, the reflected moon in the Moonside Lake, the blood moon that replaces the normal sky after Rom's death, the Great One's consistent connection to a vertical axis, to something above the ordinary world, to light that comes from directions that light does not ordinarily come from. All of this is building a picture of a cosmology where the most important things are overhead, are at a distance, are accessible only to those who've made themselves capable of looking in that direction. The concept of gaining eyes on the inside, which several NPC characters reference, is the game's way of describing the internal change that insight produces. The eyes you accumulate through insight are not literal eyes, though the transformation of certain enemies and the eye motifs on transformed bodies suggest that literalization is possible at the extreme end of the spectrum. They are receptors for a kind of perception that normal human sensory apparatus cannot access. Eyes on the inside to perceive something that ordinary eyes cannot see. This is what the choir was trying to build in the Clock Tower patients, internal eyes, the capacity to perceive the Great Ones directly, to receive the signals that the Great Ones emit without the distortion and damage that normally accompanies such reception. The experiment failed because the patients could not survive the expansion of their perceptual apparatus to the required level. Their minds broke before they could establish stable contact. The amygdala watched through the window as this happened. The cosmos in Bloodborne's cosmology is not a vacuum. It is populated, or at least it contains the Great Ones and whatever else exists at that level of reality. The nightmare spaces are not technically outer space, not in the astronomical sense, but they share a quality with the cosmic. They are outside the normal world's rules. They operate by different physics. They are accessible only by crossing a boundary that most people cannot cross. The nightmares are the stars' waiting rooms, perhaps. The spaces where the transition between human scale and Great One scale begins to be negotiated. The hunters who survive long enough in the nightmare to lose their minds are, in a sense, stuck in this transition. They have crossed the boundary but cannot complete the crossing. They're too far into the nightmare to return to ordinary reality, but not capable of going further into the Great One level. They're caught at the boundary the way insects are caught in amber, preserved in the moment of transition without ever completing it. What it would look like to complete the transition, to successfully make the crossing from human to something that can exist at the stellar level, is one of the game's central imaginary objects. The true ending suggests that the player character completes this crossing, or a version of it, by consuming 3 umbilical cords and expanding their awareness to the point where the moon presence cannot contain them. But the ending does not show a being capable of navigating the cosmos. It shows a small, helpless infant. The ascension looks like a beginning, not a completion. The completed version of what that infant might become is left entirely to the imagination. This is appropriate. The game knows what is known and does not pretend to know more. The Great Ones came from the stars. The humans want to get to the stars. The road is made of blood and madness and grief and sacrifice, and it does not have a clearly marked endpoint. What waits at the end of it, if there is an end, is something the game declines to show, because the game is set in the early stages of a journey, in the moment before the journey's destination is visible, and showing the destination would be a kind of lie. The kin, the stars, the cosmos, these are the frame around everything the game contains. The specific Great Ones we have discussed are specific events within that frame, specific encounters between the human world and the frame's contents. The frame is much larger than any of them. The game is honest about this in the way it builds its cosmology, as a suggestion of depth rather than a complete picture. The depth is implied, not shown. You cannot see the bottom of it. You can only see how far down the light reaches before it stops, and know that the bottom is further than that. The milkweed rune, obtainable in the DLC, is connected to the fishing hamlet and to Kos, and it is also connected to the concept of the kin transformation, taken in a specifically nourishing rather than destructive direction. The rune allows the player to become a kind of kin themselves, changing their appearance and their combat options. The transformation it enables is not the catastrophic failure mode kin transformation. It is a chosen, partial adoption of the kin quality. Whether this is ascension in a small sense, or simply a different flavour of compromise with the Great One influence, is left open. The stars do not answer. They never answer in any direct way in the game. The Great Ones who came from them are present in the world, but they do not speak. They do not explain themselves. They act according to their nature, whatever their nature is, and the humans who have spent generations trying to decode that nature have produced the Healing Church and the School of Mensis, and the Chalice Dungeons and the Nightmare Spaces, and eventually Yharnam on the worst night in its history. The stars look down. The stars do not care what they see. And the people below keep reaching upward, keep accumulating insight, keep going looking for the next door, that might be the right door, that might lead to the thing that makes all of it worth the cost. This is what Bloodborne is, under everything. It is a story about the impossibility of giving up on the search, even when the search has already produced enormous harm, even when everyone who pursued it ahead of you is dead or mad or trapped in a nightmare. The search continues, the stars remain, and the reaching, which is both the best and the worst thing about the kind of beings who reach, goes on. Chapter 12. The nature of the hunt, and what the Great Ones leave behind. The hunt is older than Yharnam. The hunt is older than the Healing Church, older than Gehrman, older than the pact with the moon presence that formalized it into the dream cycle the player participates in. The impulse to hunt, to manage the consequences of the blood, to contain the beast plague through organized violence, predates the institutions that made it systematic. The first time someone picked up a weapon and went after a transformed neighbour, the hunt had already begun. Gehrman gave it a name and a structure and a dream, but the hunt itself was always there, in the gap between the thing that the blood does to people and the need of everyone else to survive the doing. The Great Ones are not responsible for the hunt in any direct sense. They did not create it. They did not assign it. Whedon did not say, go out and kill the transformed, manage the beast plague, circulate the blood echoes. The hunt emerged from human response to Great One influence, in the same way that immune responses emerge from the body's encounter with pathogens. The Great Ones are the condition. The hunt is the response. The moon presence did not create the response so much as discover it and build a machine around it. This is an important distinction because it clarifies the nature of the moon presence's exploitation. The moon presence did not make hunters. It found hunters. It found Gehrman, who was already a great hunter, who was already engaged in the practice of managing the beast plague through systematic violence, and it offered him a deal that turned his existing practice into something permanent and self-sustaining. The dream is built around the hunt because the hunt already existed. The moon presence simply enclosed it. The question of what the hunt produces, from the Great One perspective, is one of the law's genuine mysteries. Blood echoes are the mechanical residue of violence in the game, but what they represent in the law is less clear. They are not simply experience points in the narrative. They are something specific to this world, something that the blood produces when it is spilled in violence, that accumulates and circulates, and that the moon presence appears to need or want. Whether other great ones also benefit from blood echoes, or whether the moon presence's specific interest in them is idiosyncratic to its nature, is not addressed. The hunters themselves, as a category, are one of the most interesting aspects of the game's world building. The hunter is not presented as a hero in any conventional sense. The hunter is a function, a tool, a mechanism for managing a specific kind of violence with more violence. The best hunters are the ones who can do this longest without either dying or losing their minds. The worst outcomes for hunters are not death, because death is just a return to the dream. The worst outcomes are transformation, becoming a beast, becoming a kin, becoming the very thing you are supposed to be hunting. Lady Maria is the most complete portrait of a hunter in the game. She is presented as a master of the craft, technically superior to almost everyone else in the game's history. She also committed suicide in the nightmare because she could not live with what the craft required of her. These two things are not in contradiction. The mastery and the moral collapse are both real and both consequential. The game does not suggest that being a better hunter would have prevented the moral problem. The moral problem is structural. It is inherent in what hunting is, in what it requires, in the specific crime of the fishing hamlet that stands as the limit case of what hunting can become. Yharnam's imprisonment in the dream is the longest portrait of what hunting costs. He has been there for an enormous span of time. He trains hunters, he sends them out, he receives them when they die, he tends the garden, he talks to the doll that resembles the woman he lost. He is deeply tired, in a way that is visible in every piece of his dialogue, in every animation his character performs. The offer he makes at the end, the offer to free the player from the dream through death, is his version of the mercy that the dream does not provide. He has been waiting to give this mercy to someone capable of receiving it. He cannot give it to himself. The dream does not extend to him the freedom he can offer to others. The hunter's dream as a physical space is a metaphor for the hunt's relationship to time. In the dream, the hunter does not age in any meaningful sense. The work continues, but the worker does not progress through a normal human life. Yharnam is old in the dream, not because he aged there, but because he was old when he arrived, and the dream has held him in that age without continuation. This is different from the way time works for humans. The dream is a kind of eternal present, a space without a future, in which the same work is done indefinitely without the accumulation of biographical time that would eventually end any normal hunter's career, through death or age. The beasts that hunters hunt are almost never straightforwardly evil either. They are transformed people. The cleric beast was a member of the church. The blood-starved beast was a hunter. The shadows of Yharnam and the shadows of the church contain traces of their former identities in their combat behaviours and their locations. The thing you are fighting was something else before it was this, and the transformation that produced this was not chosen, was not the result of bad character or moral failing. It was the result of the blood doing what the blood does. Killing beasts is necessary and insufficient at the same time. It manages the immediate consequences of the plague without addressing the plague's source. The source is the blood. The blood comes from the Great Ones, from the deepest levels of the Chalice dungeons, from the old contact that the Pthumerians established and that the church weaponized. Killing beasts does not touch this. The hunt is a maintenance activity, not a solution. This is what Yharnam knows and cannot stop knowing and cannot act on from inside the dream. The three endings of the game represent three different relationships to this situation. The first ending, Yharnam's mercy, accepts the cycle. The hunter dies, the dream ends for them. The cycle continues for whoever comes next. This is not a failure exactly. It is a recognition of limits. The hunter was part of the hunt. The hunt is what the hunt is. There is a kind of dignity in accepting this clearly and not trying to be more than you are. Yharnam has made his peace with something like this, or is trying to make his peace with it imperfectly, across an enormous span of time. The second ending, the moon presence ending, is the continuation of the cycle from inside it. The player refuses Yharnam's mercy. The moon presence arrives. The player is not capable of defeating it, and the dream continues with a new hunter caught in it, with the player now serving the function that Yharnam served. This is the worst ending, in terms of immediate outcome for the player character, but it is also the most honest about the structure. The hunt continues because the hunt always continues. The player tried to resist and failed and became part of the mechanism they were trying to step outside of. The third ending, the ascension ending, is the most ambiguous. The player has consumed the umbilical cords. The awareness has expanded. The moon presence is defeated. The player becomes an infant great one in the garden of the dream. This is the ending that Willem's intellectual tradition and Lawrence's blood tradition were both trying to reach. It is also, as noted, a beginning rather than a completion. The infant in the garden has not solved anything. It has not stopped the beast plague. It has not dismantled the church or the school of Mensis or any of the other institutions built around the blood. It has simply become a different kind of thing, in a different kind of space, and what it will do with that difference is unspecified. This is, in a way, the most honest thing Bloodborne says about the Great Ones and their relationship to humanity. Even when humanity successfully reaches the Great One level, even when the ascension is achieved, the result is small and helpless and beginning, not triumphant, not resolved. The infant player in the garden is not more powerful than the institutions that fail to reach this point. It is just differently situated, and what that situational difference will eventually amount to is a question for a time the game does not show. The Great Ones leave behind specific things when they're gone. Ebrietas leaves behind the blood that her contact with the choir produced, the knowledge that the choir misused, the transformed students in the cathedral. The moon presence leaves behind the dream, which will continue without its architect and Yharnam, who is freed from service by the player's transformation. Kos leaves behind the shore, the nightmare, the parasites in the blood of the hamlet's people, and the orphan, who is the last piece of her existence to be resolved. Mergo leaves behind the silence where the crying was, and the Mensis nightmare without its centre. What the Great Ones leave behind is, in every case, a world that has been changed by their presence and that continues to carry that change after they are gone. This is not the usual model for how gods work in fiction, where the departure of the divine restores the world to its pre-divine state. The world in Bloodborne does not restore. It accumulates. Every contact with a Great One adds something that was not there before and does not go away when the contact ends. The Pthumerians are gone, but the dungeons are still there. The blood they found is still flowing upward through every drop of medicine the church has distributed. The harvest of their contact with the Great Ones at the bottom of the earth is still being consumed by a city that does not know where the medicine comes from. This accumulation is the opposite of the hunt's maintenance function. The hunt tries to manage consequences, to keep the world at a functional level despite the Great One influence. The Great Ones keep adding more influence, not through any coordinated intention, but through their presence and their nature, and the things their presence and nature do to the world around them. The hunt is fighting a tide. The tide does not know it is being fought. The final image of the game, in the third ending, is of the doll cradling the infant player, in the garden of the dream, under a sky that is no longer red, but whatever the dream sky is when the blood moon is not rising. The doll is patient. The garden is still. The infant is very small, and the dream goes on without Gehrman, without the moon presence, a space that was built as a trap and has been emptied of its trap maker. Now just a space, waiting to become whatever the being growing in it will eventually make it. The great ones began this. Udon in the blood, Kos on the shore, Rom in the lake, Ebrietas at the altar, the moon presence behind the moon, Mergo in the nightmare, the amygdala on the buildings, all of them, all of their contacts with humanity, all of their lost children and their accumulated grief and their indifferent agendas and their accidental cruelties and their moments of something that looks like care. All of it produced this, an infant in a garden, a city in the process of being consumed, a long night almost over, and the stars still out. The stars do not change. The stars are where they were at the beginning of all of this, at the beginning of the Thumerian descent into the dark earth, at the beginning of the first human who looked up and wondered what lived up there and whether it could be reached. The stars were there before the reaching started, and they will be there after the last consequence of the reaching has played itself out. The hunt ends when the last hunter stops hunting. The blood stops when there is no one left to take it. The great ones continue because the great ones do not require any of this to continue. They were here before any of it began.